Good morning. Can I welcome everybody to the 15th meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2013. Can I remind all those present that electronic devices should be switched off at all times, particularly mobile phones obviously. Apologies have been received this morning from Neil Bibby. Mark Griffin is appearing here today as a substitute. Welcome to the committee, Mark. The first item today is to take oral evidence on our inquiry into decision making on whether to take children into care. And can I welcome to the committee this morning Professor Eileen Munro, Professor of Social Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Professor Brigid Daniel, Professor of Social Work at the University of Stirling. Good morning to you both. The theme of our session today is decision making in relation to neglect and permanence. Professor Munro recently conducted a review of child protection in England, while Professor Daniel recently co-authored a review of child neglect in Scotland. Now, I anticipate that we will draw a number of lessons from today's evidence session, and these will also inform our report when we publish it later in the year. Can I invite members to indicate when they have questions they wish to ask either of our witnesses this morning, and can I begin with Liz Smith?
Good morning. Professor Munro, I wonder if I could ask a question that's really very difficult to answer, but it's a problem that we are wrestling with as a committee, and that is that a number of stakeholders have said to us that there is a very considerable need for consistency in decision making, yet that doesn't always fit with the best interests of the child. And I noticed you said in your report that there was a bit of an imbalance between these situations. Could you just explain whether it's almost too much of an idealistic expectation to have complete consistency across the board, or whether they can actually go together?
Well, I can see the value of consistency in terms of justice and equity, but if you are making decisions about taking action with a family, you have to be influenced by your local resources. If you are thinking, should I remove this fat child, it's not should I remove him or not, but should I remove him, or can I work with his family and give them extra services to make them safe enough? So around Scotland, you're going to have great variation in resources, and even with the best will in the world, that's going to happen, that people are off sick and there's a shortage or there's no foster care placement. So I don't think consistency should be given such a high status relative to this child in this situation. Otherwise, you end up with rather mechanical decision-making, which actually then is very impersonal.
What do you think we can do better to ensure that the child's best interests are looked after across the board, that people who are working to try to help them understand that perhaps consistency isn't necessarily the most important thing?
Well, I did a review of the English system, and I know from a lot of the feedback I got from Scottish social workers that life isn't totally different here. I think it's not quite as bad. That makes me popular here, doesn't it? But if you want workers, well, particularly social workers, because I'll talk about them because they're the group I know best, but if you want them to focus on the best interests of the child, then you have to make sure that you are not telling them to focus on something else instead. And in England, the reality had become that the priority was to please the inspection service rather than to please the child. And so in terms of actually using your time, the priority was always being to keep your records up to date and meet timescales. And the quality of your work was not very visible, it wasn't very appreciated. And so over time, we've actually de-skilled and disempowered workers a great deal. And you're obviously in a better position than me to know how much that's true in Scotland. But there are some simple, well-known ways of working with families which are more effective than others that you tend to overlook, and then you end up with somewhat hostile, adversarial, bitty relationships with families, which then over time alienate families. They don't like to come forward for help. And the more that you can help the workers be skilled and show compassion and respect for people, as well as authority about what is acceptable and unacceptable, then the more you can provide a service that is actually genuinely supportive, rather than it being a rather phony name for policing.
Okay. One of the points that's been put very strongly to us is a very significant problem about the delay that some decisions take. Have you, in your report, obviously you said something about this too, but have you had any evidence that of what can make a difference to reduce that delay and therefore ensure that things are progressed much more quickly for the child?
Well, I think one of the things that's happened in England is that we created timescales for little chunks of the process, so that you had an obsession with the assessment stage and then nobody was checking how you got on after that. So in an under-resourced service, you end up putting all your energy into the start of a child's journey to receiving help and less attention to the later stages. But I am very opposed to timescales as a fixed entity for all children, because children are so varied and people should look at the child, not the timescale. But what I think would be a good idea is actually for all people involved with a child to have on their computer screen, or very easily, that the length of time since that child caused concern to somebody, so that you actually are aware that we've been worrying about this child for 6 months or for 2 years or whatever. And actually having that feedback of how long it is that the child has been living in undesirable circumstances, I think will be a much better motivator for caring professionals than some artificial timescale thought up by a committee.
Would you say that the most important reason for delay just now is administrative difficulties?
I think there's also a problem from the expertise of the workforce, because if you're not confident in your skills, then you dither and delay and avoid making decisions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Professor Daniel, can I ask whether you have any comments on those questions about consistency,
Yeah.
given your work in Scotland?
I would endorse everything Eileen's saying actually there. I think in relation to consistency, it would be very difficult to say we'll have, because one of the things people ask for is like they want an agreed threshold for action, say, and I think thresholds is a kind of chasing the rainbow, really. It's just not possible. But what you can have, I think, is consistency of approach and consistency of principles that underpin your practice. Consistency of, for example, attention to the developmental stage of the child and the extent to which their development is progressing as one would expect to. So I think there are a number of principles we could... Well, we know what the principles are that you'd need for effective practice. And one of the things I would say is, I mean, you might expect academics to say we need more research. I think we probably don't actually need very much more. What we need is more really sort of concerted effort to put the research we already have into practice, because we know quite a lot about the principles that underpin effective practice, particularly with neglect, which feels very intractable and difficult for practitioners. But we know enough now to know the sort of things that are associated with authoritative practice. And that has to be the key. It's the combination of the support and warmth and empathy with very clear boundaries about what has to change by when, and if not, what will happen, and keeping a real focus on the children's development. That is in some ways quite simple, but in other ways complex. So it requires straightforward attention to the simple fact that that child's life is pretty miserable and needs to be improved, but a willingness to tolerate the complexity of all the different factors that might be affecting that. And it needs all the different professions to pull together on understanding that.
Can I ask your opinion of something that's come up in the committee a few times, and that in particular when we spoke to young people who had been through the care system, which was the issue of, and it goes back to this issue of consistency, I suppose, of decision making, where an elder sibling, after a number of years being brought to the attention of professionals, is removed, a decision is taken and they're removed from the parental home, but younger siblings living in exactly the same home are left within the parental home. Now, I know there's a tension between taking each child as an individual case and dealing with it individually, and the position where the difference between the responsibility and behaviour of the parents between each of those children doesn't seem to be much different, certainly to me. I just wondered what your view is of that tension between these two things.
Want me to do that first? Yeah. That's actually been given a name by the academic community, the Start Again syndrome. Marion Brand has talked about that quite a bit, which is this tendency with each new child to think, well, now here's an opportunity. And of course, when someone is expecting their next child, they often feel very sort of optimistic about this time we'll maybe be able to make it work. And there is, I think, a tendency within the system to err too much on the not looking back at the history with the previous children that have been removed, but to have that optimism. And as a practitioner, you have to remain optimistic that people can change, otherwise you'd just give up. You wouldn't have a social work profession.
I'm not so much talking about where effectively a child is removed and then another child is born subsequently. I'm talking about there are two children currently in the home.
One's taken and one's left, and there'll be a whole range of decision makings that will go into that. And I can see how it might often be and might often seem inconsistent, yes. And part of it depends on the extent to which I think people take children and young people's own views into account. One of the difficulties of neglect, of course, is that children don't always know what it is they're not getting until they have a different experience and then realise what it is that they have been missing out on. And so, yes, it is a tension. I mean, you've articulated it between treating each child as an individual, but also being sensible and consistent in your decisions, and also looking at the potential fit between where the child, if the child is being removed, you've got to have a good place for them to go, and the fit for that, and that requires a very, very good alternative care system.
Professor Munro?
Yeah.
Well, I think there are certainly times when that can be a very sensible decision to leave one child and remove another, but there are also a lot of times when it's a sign of rather poor reasoning, either because you haven't paid much attention to the other child and really talked to him and found out the quality of his life, but it can also be that you think, well, the older child has now become extremely disturbed in his behaviour and is showing all the adverse effects of poor parenting, so we'll wait until the next one's equally damaged before we remove him. And I think as well that people can do it without considering what harm are we doing by separating the siblings. You know, what is the cost of that as well? So I think, yeah, there are times when it's a sensible decision, but I think there are a lot of times when it's a very dubious decision.
Okay, thank you for that. Neil Finlay.
Yeah, a number of young people who've been through care who we spoke to talked about being removed from the home and then allowed back and then removed again and allowed back, and this sort of what people refer to as rule of optimism that I think Professor Daniel referred to there, and that they themselves told us that, you know, they wished that there had been a decision made once and for all at an earlier stage, because they felt as though they were more damaged and their relationships were more damaged because of that continual back and forth. How do we deal with that issue, and how can we prevent that from happening?
Well, again, I think it's the quality of the professional work about whether you are returning them home just hoping things go better, or whether you actually have a plan of working with the family and monitoring what's going on. And I think it is justice requires you to give parents a chance if you think they have some potential for providing the home, because the child has a right to be with their birth family if possible. You know, it's not just the parents' rights, it's also the child's rights. But you get that kind of in and out pattern. Sometimes, of course, for good reason. If you've got a parent with a relapsing illness, they may come into care every time they're chronically ill, you know, have an acute phase and back home again. But it's very often an example of poor quality assessment and a failure to make the very firm decision, that's it. But I think you want authoritative social practice, as Brigid said, but you also want that authority to be based on competence, not on ignorance. And I think, for me, improving and allowing the workforce to operate to a skilled level is where we need to go for improvements, rather than in getting focused on process and administrative details.
Yeah, can I? There's a couple of big research studies that would actually back up what those young people are talking about. Both Elaine Farmer has been doing some research on reunification of children being removed from neglect, and Jim Wade and colleagues. And they're both finding a similar pattern, that there's a tendency, not for all, but for some cases, children being removed from home and then returned to situations where nobody's actually done anything to fix the problem that led to the removal in the first place. Now, objectively, anyone would say, well, that's just a silly system. You know, if you're going to remove a child from a situation, you need to do something to fix the situation before they go back. Now, both of those studies have identified very good examples of what is associated with that working better. And that's to do with proper plans for returning home, returning them not too quickly, taking the time to do it properly, and paying very close attention to the features that have led to the children coming into care in the first place. Quite often parental substance misuse, parental mental health issues, and you need skilled, really focused, concerted attempts to deal with that. The other approach that's showing some promise is the family drug and alcohol courts that they have been trialling, which do that very, very authoritative, we need to see something change before the child goes back bit. And that is associated with things turning out a bit better, more on the whole. So if we could really keep a focus on dealing with the things that have led to the problems in the first place, then it's perfectly reasonable to remove the child for a while, work on that, and to return them home. But if it's because of things have just drifted, or sometimes children just vote with their feet, actually, and just go, or they make it very difficult for the carers to continue to look after them, then that is more drifting. And what Aileen Farmer describes, is the difference between passive practice and authoritative, proactive practice. And the difference is much more to do with the local authorities where the children are and the culture of practice than it is to do with the characteristics of the children and the families. So it all depends on the quality of the systems and the people working within those in different authorities. So that it's useful to have a look at some of their work, I think, on that.
The cases that I was referring to aren't particularly about illness, or, well, it all depends how you assess illness, because a number of them were substance misuse where there was episodic events happening, but also mental health problems where there's continual problems there. But that links into what you mentioned about the de-skilling of social workers, because throughout this inquiry we've heard that, quite a number of times that social workers aren't particularly engaged in that one-to-one work, that preventative work, that rehabilitative work that historically they may have, and that more so they are seen as being the big baddie who comes and does something bad to a family. And there's all sorts of issues about resources and the rest of it. I wonder if you'd care to comment on that. Is that how social workers are now being seen, as or do they still have that other role?
If you give them the chance, they have a lot of those skills, or they at least have the appetite to gain those skills. And I have seen, not just in the UK, but in other countries, that where you turn the system upside down and say, instead of our primary aim being to comply with all the the administrative process, you say our primary aim is to get to know this family well and to help them parent better, then you will find very radical improvements in the number of children who can stay safely at home. And the work done in the Hackney model, I don't know if you've heard of that, but in the London Borough of Hackney, they developed a radically new way of working with families, which put the emphasis on skilled engagement with families with high-quality clinical supervision. And there, what you have found is that by having a much more intensive service to problematic families, the overall cost to the local authority has dropped, because they are keeping children at home. They don't have the cost of the removal, and the re-referral rate is dropping as well. And there's also places working with the signs of safety approach, which has a great deal of similarity. But again, the emphasis is on getting to know the family and the extended family, and making it clear to them what's wrong with their parenting, not just sort of vague, you've got mental health issues, but actually saying what this means for a 2-year-old child, and engaging their motivation, or you can see that you're not engaging their motivation and you have to remove the child. But that also is leading to children being able to stay at home and not get re-referred into the system.
Yeah, Edinburgh's using signs of safety actually as well. So I think there is a really, really mixed picture. There's a lot of social workers doing a lot of brilliant work. And of course, the problem with preventive work is you don't know it's happened, because you don't hear about that so much. And we're not actually very good at going and looking at where things are actually working well. And I know from running a lot of post-qualifying provision that there are social workers, because I read a lot of about what the work they're doing, and there's doing a lot of really creative work. Part of it depends on the setting within which they're working. So we need to think about the service and the profession. There's a lot of qualified social workers working in a lot of different settings, and a lot working in voluntary organisations, delivering very specialist support and doing it really well when they have the structure to do it. Part of the difficulty for social workers is if they're working in a setting which restricts their time to do that direct work. And then, of course, the skills to do it become eroded. But there are a lot who are doing it. And given the right opportunities, as Eileen is saying, then they can and they want to. And I think, see, what we've also got going on in Scotland at the moment is this big push for the early intervention prevention, and that to be delivered very much by the universal services. And that's another issue about whether we have enough health visitors, but I'm sure you've had separate lobbies on that. But I would absolutely say that is a very strong and sensible thing. We reserve social workers for, the heavy end type thing. However, what we do need quite often at the early stage is expertise engaging the extent and capacity and willingness of the parents to change with the support that they're offered. So health visitors, teachers can offer a lot of really helpful preventive support, but what they sometimes need is the skill of social work to assess whether those parents are actually going to be able to change quickly enough for the child's development. So we don't want too much of a split. I think what we need is for the expertise of social work to be able to be available across the board, not just split by service or split by profession. Have I articulated that okay? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So it's that bit, because if we just rely on health visitors and teachers doing all that supportive work, they will do a lot of it and it's very good, but they might flounder a bit in that more in-depth assessment of capacity to change.
Actually, that's one of my recommendations in the English system, was that people in the other services should be able to have a conversation with a social worker about a concern to help them formulate that thought about whether it's worrying enough to actually ask for a deeper assessment or not, rather than having to go through a 10-page referral form. There's a lot of providing that kind of expertise, instead of always thinking of moving families across into child protection, of actually thinking families want consistency of relationships, and so bring in the child protection component when it's needed.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Vera. I wanted to pick up on a point raised by Professor Munro. She made a statement that it's the right of the child to be with the birth parent. Isn't that taking some assumptions that is perhaps the best thing for the child? I mean, how much weight is actually given to that, as opposed to the...
If possible, and it is in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that's why. It's probably in your legislation as well. But it is... Of course, it's about when is it possible or when is it not, but the state does have a responsibility to try and make it possible to a certain degree. If you look at the guidance from the United Nations, it is that there should be support services for families as well as a reactive child protection service.
I think the point I was coming to was that how much weight is actually given to this, and we've taken evidence in the past which has indicated that many social workers are relatively inexperienced who are making these decisions, which often leads to what's been referred to as the rule of optimism. So how much weight is given to the right of the child to be with the birth parents? How much is that influencing inexperienced social workers in terms of the right, the rule of optimism?
Right. Well, there certainly is a lot of evidence about the rule of optimism. I'm not sure if it's limited to new social workers or not. I think it's partly society does rather vary in the message it gives, and that there are times when it's saying you should never leave a child in any danger, and then it gets into a paddy when you take away a lot of children. So I think there is no right, but it's always a pendulum, and you're trying not to swing too far either way. But the reality is if you remove children, you will make a lot of mistakes of removing children who could have stayed at home. And if you aim to keep children at home, there is a higher probability that some of them will be harmed. But I don't think... I'm not keen on maligning social workers, so... and I think that you should not have newly qualified social workers making decisions of that nature. They're the most fundamental, important decisions you can make, and they should be made by very experienced people.
In previous evidence that's been taken, there's been questions raised about the level and quality of training of social workers and the support that they get in making these decisions. Would you be able to comment on that?
Well, the services where I have seen fantastic improvements in the service being given to families all have the feature of making decision-making a group process, not an individual talking to a supervisor in a rushed 10 minutes. And that, I mean, if you look at the reclaiming social work model, it's about having a social work unit of 5 people, which includes somebody from a clinical background of child and mental health services, so they have a very good clinical component to add to it. But if you actually have a group of people talking through, between them, they can think of all the options, they can challenge all of the evidence, they can do the kind of critical appraisal that you might get in a court of law, and is actually what's needed around this importance of decision. But I think that bringing in of other voices and challenges is part of checking the quality of your reasoning and then making it more likely you'll come to a good decision.
I help to educate social workers. I think we do not too bad a job of it. It's a combination of things you need. There's only so much you can fit into a social work degree, which is really what's really scary, and what you have to avoid is doing what they're attempting to do in England, which is slim it right back and have a much more reduced social work light kind of training. But even with the best will in the world, you can only fit so much in. But a lot of the difference depends on the facilitating conditions and where people end up working and what ongoing support there is for continuing professional development or not. And where you see places where they really support ongoing learning and development, then you can see really, really skilled social work practice. Where that's really restricted, where people are made to follow lots of guidelines, then you see things kind of closing down in. As with all professions, the initial qualification is the start, and then it's what happened next that makes a lot of difference to the quality of the practice that they develop. And of course, it's not individual social workers anyway that are actually making the decisions. I mean, they're making recommendations, but there's a whole swathe of, as you know, there's the whole child protection investigatory system, which is a multidisciplinary system. We also have all the children's hearing system. We often have children going through both of those. So there's a whole range of different decision-making bodies coming into play here, and social workers have to try and help navigate or work with children to navigate through some of that system. And sometimes they're thwarted in the things that they would like to happen by some of these structures and systems as well.
Okay, thank you. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much. We've touched on the importance of assessments again today, and that was very much, I think, a theme consistent across the panel. We took evidence from last week, and notwithstanding some of the risks associated with perhaps attaching too rigid timescales to how and when that assessment ought to take place, clearly it's absolutely fundamental to the decisions that are then subsequently taken. And we heard last week, I think, of evidence of cases where assessments were being made by people who perhaps didn't necessarily have the experience in order to make those complex assessments, right through to a visit we took to Glasgow to witness the New Orleans model, where I think there's far more of a joined up approach to the way in which that assessment's taking place. I mean, obviously there's the element of training and indeed ongoing professional development are key to this. But are there any sort of recommendations you would make about how we improve that assessment process?
Well, I think the other point I made around the group supervision element is a very good way of helping to fill in the gaps of somebody. If they are to start to say, well, that there are mental health issues, this is something that really irritates me, that's why I quote it, but somebody in the group will say, what exactly do you mean? What illness and what behaviour does it produce, and how does that affect the parents, the parenting? The other point I would raise, I don't know what kind of assessment forms you have in Scotland, but in England we had this government-produced integrated children's system which has been very dysfunctional, and it encourages people to put little blocks of data into different boxes on different screens, and then people are surprised that they can't pull it together and get a full picture of the family. So I think there's a lot of development work to be done around how the technology can support good assessment rather than hinder it. And I'm convinced there's a lot more that it could do to help people, to alert them when they've forgotten something, and to ask them questions. I think technology could be very, very useful, but the way we've used it so far has been more about gathering data for management than for helping practitioners think.
We've got a very, very good model in Scotland in the Getting It Right for Every Child model for assessment. We've got all the basis there for doing really good comprehensive assessments, and we have the knowledge base with the combined professional expertise to be able to undertake good assessments. One of the things we know that people struggle with is the analysis bit. People are quite good at gathering lots and lots of information, but the key bit is then taking the time to work out what that actually means and make sense of it. And that needs basically headspace time, thinking through and working out what it actually means. That's the bit where sometimes people often struggle. And that is, I think, as I'm saying, it requires people to sit down and just work through what it actually means. And the other difficulty we have is a tendency to reassess and reassess. An assessment can be a very good way to feel as if you're doing something, but it's a bit like writing lists, But you then have to tick things off that list and actually do it. And sometimes we get a bit stuck. And that's got another expression, of course, assessment paralysis, they call that, which is you get stuck in the assessment phase. And one of the challenges in the multidisciplinary field, and this is something we'll have to tackle as when the Children and Young People Bill, when she comes through, is that how we get different professions to trust each other's assessments so that each one doesn't feel they need to reassess. When a health visitor's done an initial assessment, and the social worker will say, well, we need to now do our assessment. In the Highland Pathfinder, they did lots and lots of work to try and overcome that problem, and that was pretty successful. They got a single plan, single assessment, and they agreed to work together on producing an assessment, rather everyone doing little separate bitty ones. So there are models. We've got a very good evidence-based, perfectly good structured model for assessment. We've got the components in place, but it needs attention to some of that nitty-gritty stuff about how you actually then put some of that into practice and how you work collectively to do that.
In terms of that collective work, are there issues that we should be concerned about in terms of the different approach that the different professionals involved take, either to the assessment or indeed to the analysis that flows from that assessment, or is that a sort of creative tension that you need in order to come to the
They
right
wouldn't be
decision?
different professions if they had the same knowledge and skill, would they?
Mm. Yeah.
Obviously, Liam.
Indeed.
Yeah. I've seen lots of very effective multidisciplinary practice. Things have changed dramatically over the last few years. And so we had the Child Protection Reform Programme here in Scotland that actually has been kind of a little bit forgotten about, but it was hugely influential in bringing in the universal services much more to the fore in their responsibility for the well-being of children. Now that has actually changed dramatically. It's people in universal services no longer to be convinced that they have a role in the protection of children. They're more now, they know it, they worry about it, they're just not quite sure quite how best to do it. Well, that's a better place to be than thinking, well, it's not my job at all. Everyone now, it trips off everybody's tongue. It's my responsibility, it's everyone's job, we're all in this together. So what they're looking for now is just support for the next stage of actually then working out the intricacies of how that actually works on the ground. Who takes responsibility for what? Moving away from the cover your back bit, the fear of being hung out to dry, all of that sort of thing needs to be sort of worked through on the ground to enable people to do what they actually want to do. to work together for the benefit of children. I see lots of huge urge to want to do it. It's not like we have to persuade people.
I think what you've described clearly is a degree of collective responsibility for
Yes.
what flows out of that.
Yes.
And I mean, I certainly appreciate that people will come at this with different perspectives. But is there, in terms of that, giving effect to that collective responsibility, is there anything in the way that systems are operating at the moment which suggests that then assigning responsibility for taking forward any actions is kind of falling between stools, or is it clearly understood who is responsible for what aspect of
It's patchy, it's variable. It's variable, that. And it does depend on the quality of planning in different places. Some you see very clear plans where it's really clear who's responsible for what and by when, and others it's much more open. So there is a lack of consistency about that bit, I would say, being very clear about who's taking what forward and what would happen.
I don't know whether this applies in Scotland, but it certainly applies in many other countries' children's services, that there is a layer of problem which tends to get neglected, so that the families that are very problematic get into the child protection system. The families that are mild to moderately dysfunctional get services, but the ones who are not bad enough to get a child protection reaction, but too challenging for the universal services, end up with nothing. But you'd be better placed than me to know. But you know that there is a bit of a gap between what universal services have upped their game and are dealing with more, yes, but they haven't got it up to the point where the child protection service takes over.
Yeah, I would recognise that here as well. It's that bit in the middle, that sort of nebulous grey area in the middle where everyone's a bit unsure who's responsible for what.
Okay, thank you. Claire Adamson.
Thank you. It was really a supplementary question in the area of technology that you mentioned. I'm envisaging, from what you were saying, moving away from a sort of basic case management system to more of an expert system that would actually prompt certain responses in certain areas. And I was just wondering if you'd come across examples of this in practice elsewhere.
In medicine, there are some nice examples where you sort of type in appendicitis and you can immediately go straight to a website that tells you in detail about it. But I'm aware of a lot of experimental work being done in many, many countries. There seems to have been a common pattern of a government investing billions in a very, very dysfunctional system and finally conceding that it has to be scrapped. So I would expect that there are some progress. I mean, even things like putting in a genogram into the software, and also not a genogram, but a gram which shows all of the professionals involved, ecogram. But that can be, just visually, they can help people's thinking that they don't forget things, and don't forget the other child in the family, for instance. And the role of narrative relative to just data boxes is fairly well evidenced that it's a much better way of getting the human thought going. But I think the other thing to remember is that the kind of deep thinking required to do a good analysis and make decisions is very effortful, and human beings are lazy. And so you will find that people have to be encouraged to do it. You know, the way you get drift in child welfare so much is partly that it's so tough to make the decision that people delay, not because of peculiarities about them. Human beings tend to behave that way. And so, there again, I think group supervision is really great in providing the encouragement and challenge to actually get on and make the decision.
Okay, thank you. George Adam.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Some of the evidence we've already taken is that the structure itself is very complex, and this can cause a delay and cause some problems between. Do you think, is there any other way that we could probably work it better, the whole structure, that would put the child at the centre, or the benefit of the child at the centre?
Well, when I was asked to do the review of the English system, one of my early resolutions was that I would not make recommendations for structural reorganisation, because I am old enough to have seen so many reorganisations, none of which have led to a substantial difference And so people are very happy to get rid of them when a new idea comes along. So I wouldn't put my energy into structure. I think it's much more in the people and helping them do the job.
It is. I mean, we do have an interesting hybrid system in Scotland, as it's been described, because we have obviously the children's hearing system, very welfare-driven kind of approach, which is very different from the system in England. But we've also got the investigative bit, which is quite similar in many ways, and they have a sort of an alliance. There are some complexities about how these two systems align. So, for example, through the child protection system, you can have children considered for, neglect, whereas in the hearing system, it might be characterised more as lack of parental care. And there are some children going through both, and some children going through one or the other. So it is a complex kind of hybrid system. But it can work okay, or it cannot. I mean, one of the difficulties with the hearing system is that people have been misusing it instead of as a way of gaining compulsion on the child and family, as a way of gaining compulsion on local authorities to provide services. So sometimes universal services will make a referral to the children's hearing because they feel it's a way of kind of upping the ante. It's not really truly because necessarily the family needs some sort of compulsion. It's more about trying to unlock some services. Now, that's not a sensible way to use it. And we found that years ago when we were doing the audit and review of child protection in Scotland. So it is a slightly hybrid, complex system. And one of the other things is that we don't actually... The way our data is collected, and I do think it's quite useful sometimes as well to collect some management information, is the two systems don't link up in terms of the data we collect. So the child protection statistics are not linked with the children's hearing statistics. So you don't actually know. We couldn't just say how many children are the same children in both systems. That seems... So I think there's things we could do to make it easier to know what's happening without necessarily dismantling the whole thing. That does seem a bit odd to me that we don't actually tie those statistical systems together.
Would there be... So there wouldn't be scope, you don't think, to actually merge the two? Be more sharing of information?
Well, there is a lot of sharing of information already. I mean, in some areas, the children's reporter attends case conferences, for example. So there is a lot. So there's a variety. There is, in some places, there's a lot. They work very closely together. But it will depend on the reporter and the local authorities and how they work together. Scotland has a very passionate view about its children's hearing system. Whenever you try to mess with it, you get a hell of a lot of squeals. So if you
I'm just asking a question.
There are those that argue that in the hearing system we have got the child protection system. Why do we need something else? I think if we could have moved to the system as envisaged through the GERFEC approach, where we reserve both compulsory elements for where they're really needed, it becomes less of an issue because we don't necessarily need to be shoveling children through either of those systems if we get in quite early and provide the right kind of support early enough. Then you only reserve the compulsory element for when you genuinely actually do need a compulsion. So I think it's more to do with misuse rather than... you could unpick the whole thing, and it might be quite fun to start afresh. But, it could deflect a lot of time and energy, I think, as Aileen says.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin Griffin.
So, my question had been answered, I think, in part to Aileen Finley's on the support for parents. Maybe you can elaborate. You did mention on the support for parents from children returning to families, and you mentioned about sometimes it was an incorrect decision to return children to families, but in a lot of cases it might be the right decision as well, and just because of the lack of support for the families, we then see them returning to care. Professor Daniel outlined some of the support for families, but I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Well, the neglect has a 1,000 different causes, so it isn't as if there's a single way of responding that would be relevant to them all. But there's quite a lot that can be achieved by working, showing warmth and authority, and being very clear about what you're bothered about. I mean, one of the realities is that parents often don't know why people are concerned about their parenting. But if you can explain why it's having an adverse effect on the child, you can, with many parents, harness some motivation to try and change. And then you can look at the wider family and their friends to see what other supports they could have and how they could solve problems. I think you can also spend millions of dollars on buying expensive American manualized services, which, a large component of why they work is because they make sure that the worker has the time to create a therapeutic relationship with the family and motivate them to stay consistently around and to keep on helping them and being clear about what needs to change. So, and I would warn you that when they say that something works, what they mean is that in a controlled trial, the service that they've studied is superior to services as normal in an American state. And services as normal in Scotland are probably very different. I think it would be better to put your money into helping your existing workforce do the basic things well.
Yeah. In relation to intervention with neglect, there's quite a few sort of, again, looking at consistency of principles that we know are more likely to be effective. And some recent research that Action for Children commissioned into looking at their work in their family centres, which showed some quite promising signs of the effectiveness of being able to improve situations, even in quite chronic neglect. And we know that you need a good work therapeutic relationship with somebody, one of the practitioners. We know it needs to be sustained and long-term, not episodic, so you get away from that revolving door thing. It's got to be really sustained, very focused, very structured, very clear, authoritative and warm. And yes, using some particular techniques perhaps, but a lot is about just sticking with it and being really determined. But also, if you do that, then that gives you very, very good evidence as to, in fact, whether somebody can change or not. Because if you try the best and someone still hasn't responded quickly enough, then you should take really quick action and remove the child, because you've then got very good evidence that whatever you throw at it isn't going to make a difference.
Also, in fact, in the places where they are putting more effort into working creatively and warmly with families, when you reach the decision that they really cannot parent the child well enough, you get a lot less adversarial behaviour at that point, because the parents are often in a position to understand why. They may be very sad about it, but they do appreciate that you're making a sensible decision.
Okay, thank you. Liam MacArthur.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up. I think Mr. Daniel, you referred to the problem of the revolving door and sort of episodic interventions, and you talked earlier about being able to try and target the interventions that then avoid the need to go down the route, either the children's hearing system or child protection. We heard an evidence last week about perhaps a difference in terms of the approach of children and family social workers and those dealing with adult social work, where the latter were seen to take more of a sort of long-term approach, because that's the sort of interventions that are perhaps more characteristic of the work they're involved in, whereas children and family social workers, perhaps because of the time frames for a child are obviously very, very different, are more used to taking a short-term perspective, trying to respond to very difficult circumstances. Is that something that you would agree with in terms of its characterisation? Is there anything we could and should be doing to try and rebalance that, to ensure more of a long-term approach? Or is it just the nature of the work that both are involved?
It is an interesting observation. It probably bear a little bit more exploration as to, how prevalent that actually is, if there's a difference. I think certainly those working in adult services have very good understandings about the cycle of change and relapse and lapse and all that kind of thing. So they do have an understanding, often if they're working with substance misuse particularly, about some of those issues, which adds all the more to the point that multidisciplinary work isn't necessarily just meaning across professions, but across different bits of the same system. And of course, as we're moving towards more integrated services, but whilst we're joining up some bits, we might be pulling apart some other bits. So we're getting more integrated adult services of health and social work, focusing on adult services, and more integrated children's services. The danger then is you pull apart the children and adult bit rather than bringing those bits together to get the expertise of those working with the adults and those working with the children. And in the children and family sector, I think one of the slight shifts that's required in terms of throughput and what's considered to be a good outcome is that sometimes keeping a case open should be seen as a better outcome than shutting a case and moving things on. You know, we're driven by shut, move on, close, you know, go on to the next one. And that's seen as success, whereas actually keeping things open and working on them also sometimes needs to be seen as a successful outcome. And that is a process and a system and a resource issue, really. So, yeah, we need actually the adult and the children's services to work closely together. And again, that has dramatically changed. It's still got problems, but since the Getting Our Priorities Right agenda, and I know there's another one coming out fairly soon, there has been a lot more attention in the adult services to their responsibilities to working with those who are working with the children as well. There's more that could be done, but the readiness is there.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to ask a question really around the area of how we move away from a system that's based on crisis towards one that's based on prevention and in early intervention, and what some of the barriers might be in that. And Professor Daniel, you actually used the phrase "unlock the services," which I thought was quite telling, because to me it's you know, it's a picture of gatekeepers and you know, all these kind of problems. So it was really just if you had a comment on whether although we have GIRFEC and that's where we want to be with it, are we moving in the right direction to make that a reality in terms of changing the service?
The rhetoric's there, the will is there, the evidence is there. I mean, Harry Burns is never done talking about it, is he? Early intervention, you know, the need for it. And absolutely. But of course, for a while, you're then going to need some parallel funding, aren't you? Dual funding. Because we're not, even if we have aspirations that early intervention takes away some of the more crisis stuff, you still have to be dealing with the crisis stuff in the meantime. And the real tussle, I know, in speaking to people in local authorities, is how can they justify moving their resources across whilst they still have quite a lot of crises to deal with? And they're going to need some support and some real clever financial thinking and resource management to try and do both at the same time, because you can't just switch from one to the other. The Highland Pathfinder, I think, was quite hopeful in what it showed about there has been a move upstream, I think, there, but they put a lot of resources and time into the Highland Pathfinder to get to that place, which is why all the other local authorities get grumpy about it, say, well, it was all right for the Highlands because they got all this extra support. But they did show some promising signs of moving things upstream a bit, I think. But it does need, you can't just switch from one to the other, and that's why I think people get frustrated when they're the ones who are in charge of planning all the resources, when everyone's saying, well, move to early intervention, prevention. The argument's well made, but it's a bigger group of people, obviously, because it's a bigger net. So you're spreading your resources thinner, and what do you do with the crises that are still going on? So good aspiration, but it needs a lot more kind of working through, I would say.
Professor Munro, would you like to?
Well, I'm not able to comment on the Scottish position in particular, but one thing it's worth looking at is how much time is spent within the current system on making referrals, doing assessments and not providing a service. Because I know in England, a couple of local authorities, when I was doing my review, did a kind of monitoring the life of a case and realising that from a child's point of view, they got referred and batted back and referred, batted back, referred, assessed and batted back, several times before actually receiving a service. And you do feel that if the first person had been able to get a service for them, you'd have saved quite a lot of professional time. So, the current system of having very tight gatekeeping is extremely wasteful.
Do you think that the services use partners and other outside organisations as well as they might, and even sort of very simple like the reading initiative and the library initiative, things like these? Do you think that those are being used enough in actually as a service in tackling some of the problems?
I can talk to that.
Patchy again. It is patchy. I think again it's actually, I think Eileen's observation about the two ends of the spectrum in the middle bit is really helpful, because I think for a lot out in the community where there's sort of low-level problems, there's a lot of that kind of support being provided. And yes, and the children we're really, really worried about, we're piling a lot in. For the ones in the middle, I think it's very hard to keep track of all the different things that are on offer, and we still have a tendency towards this setting up things, short-term funding them, and then they shut. And by the time the local social work team has found out that there's a particular scheme running, it's just about to be run down again. And there is some reluctance to refer people into things that there's not a security of funding for as well. So I think it is quite patchy. I mean, there is actually a lot of stuff out there. It's true, there's a lot of things going on. But it can be a little bit piecemeal, and it is very difficult for people to keep track of them, especially when they keep starting and stopping again. We need that much more sort of sustained approach to services, I think.
And just a final question on that area in terms of the training of social workers in particular. Has the training and the qualifications changed to reflect the new direction in terms of early intervention and GIRFIC?
Well, yes, I would say we certainly teach GIRFIC on our programmes. Yes, I mean, the heads of social work courses meet regularly. We also meet regularly with the regulatory body, and we also get inputs from the Care Inspectorate, and also a lot of discussion with employers. So there's quite a lot of interaction and interchange about things that are changing and developing. But obviously, we have to be looking at all the personalisation agenda and the self-directed care agenda as well. So that's something that's coming in. There's probably always a little bit of a lag, but certainly most of us are out and about this kind of thing and doing things, so we kind of know what's going on and try to incorporate it. But some of it obviously then needs to be done post-qualifying, because you just can't do everything on an initial course. So it's also about whether organisations are learning organisations, whether they're providing opportunities for their staff to continue to learn, and some are better at that than others.
Thank you.
Thank you. Liam MacArthur.
I think that was answered. The issue about whether further research was required. So I think that's already been answered.
Well, I know that. I'm going to ask the question. And you did say no. I mean, I realise you said no earlier on, but I would perhaps it'd be helpful if you explained that a little bit, expanded on the no.
Well, there's a yes and a no.
Because I have to say, it rather surprised me at least that a researcher said there should be.
Yeah,
it doesn't need
we
any
probably
more research.
need a bit of research in how we can better put research that we already have into practice, and that sounds a bit convoluted, but actually I think that's probably the case. I mean, quite a lot of the research we're doing, which has been like comparing different sort of care outcomes for children, what we haven't really done is much research into service as usual. The actual we do lots of research on special manualised programmes, on particular approaches, but just what is going on in the collective activity of all these people with all their goodwill for children. We don't really have enough on the aspects of that really support children at home. But a lot of what that would be supporting them to actually use the knowledge we already have more effectively. So I don't want any more research that tells us that neglect is bad for children, for example, because we've got plenty of that. And it's easy to do that kind of research because you'll find plenty of evidence. So it's more about the kind of how to support people to work more authoritatively. And we could do some quite interesting, I think, developmental action type research around that.
Okay. Professor Munro, do you agree?
Yeah, actually I've been doing some of that, both in England and in Australia. And it's really fascinating to work with the reform process and to see how it's operating intellectually and emotionally and what impact it's having on the families. But there is, as Brigid said, we actually have some bits of wisdom. We can't make human life perfect, but we do have some wisdom that we're not making full use of at the moment. And in fact, we've ended up with a system that in many ways insults parents and alienates them and demoralises them and probably makes them worse parents as a result. So there is a lot we could do with what we know already.
Okay, can I thank you both very much for coming along this morning. It's been very helpful in terms of our work on our inquiry, and can I suspend the meeting? Thank you. Can I welcome members back. Today we are starting stage 2 consideration of the Post-16 Education in Scotland Bill. Can I welcome Mike Russell, the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning, and his accompanying officials to the committee. The officials are, of course, not allowed to participate in the formal proceedings. I don't think, have we got any other non-committee members here at the moment? Yes, we do. Marco Biaggi has joined us. I know, Marco, you've got an amendment you wish to speak to later on, so welcome to the committee this morning. Everyone should have a copy with them of the bill as introduced, the first marshalled list of amendments that was published on Friday, and the first groupings of amendments, which sets out the amendments in the order in which they will be debated. We will not go beyond section 4 of the bill today. there will be one debate on each group of amendments. I will call the member who lodged the first amendment in that group to speak to and move that amendment, and to speak to all the other amendments in the group. All other members with amendments in the group, including the Cabinet Secretary if relevant, will then be asked to speak to them. Members who have not lodged amendments in the group but who wish to speak should indicate by either catching my eye or the clerk's attention. If he has not already spoken in the group, I will invite the Cabinet Secretary to contribute to the debate just before moving to the winding up speech. The debate on the group will be concluded by me inviting the member who moved the first amendment to the group to wind up. Following debate on each group, I will check whether the member who moved the first amendment in the group wishes to press it to a vote or to withdraw. If they wish to press ahead, I will put that question on that amendment. If a member wishes to withdraw their amendment after it has been moved, they must seek the committee's agreement to do so. If any committee member objects, the committee immediately moves to the vote on the amendment. If any member does not want to move their amendment, when called, they should say not moved. Please note that any other MSP may move such an amendment if they so desire. If no one moves the amendment, I will immediately call the next amendment on the marshalled list. Only committee members are allowed to vote. Voting in any division is by a show of hands. It's important that members please keep their hands in the air until the clerks have recorded the vote, and the committee is required to indicate formally that it has considered and agreed each section of the bill, and so I will put a question on each section at the appropriate point. Can I now move to stage 2 of the Post-16 Education Scotland Bill? And I will begin with a question, and the question is that section 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Can I now call Amendment 12 in the name of Liz Smith? This is grouped with Amendments 7 and 23. Liz Smith to move Amendment 12 and speak to all other amendments in the group. Liz Smith.
Thank you, Convener. I think one of the central issues in the debate about the Post-16 Bill is that of ensuring that the universities are able to maintain what they themselves have defined as responsible autonomy, namely full accountability and transparency when it comes to the use of public money, but also the ability to decide for themselves without government interference as to how best to maintain the academic structures which will continue to deliver the exceptionally high standards of higher education to which Scotland is accustomed, and which have ensured that Scottish universities have held their competitive edge when measured against the rest of the world. That academic freedom is one of the key principles which has underpinned the university system in Scotland for hundreds of years, and one which has been defined by the university sector as the reason for their success. Indeed, when this committee heard from 4 university principals, they made it very plain that it was that academic freedom that was such a core part of the flexibility required to lead the field in research, in innovation and in knowledge exchange, all of which are increasingly regarded as the key components to which universities are measured. The point is rightly made too that those higher education systems around the world which are most successful are those where the government is less rather than more involved, and therefore it does not seem to make much sense for Scotland to move in the opposite direction, whereby the control of ministers and the Scottish Funding Council would be considerably extended. In particular, the idea that ministers and or the Scottish Funding Council could in effect be involved in university management is not something that was agreeable to the sector, and that is why, Convener, I have submitted Amendment 12 so as to remove the term management. Likewise, with reference to Amendment 7, and given again the comments from the sector, I think it would be inappropriate for ministers to be involved in imposing conditions on universities that would effectively mean that part of the financial payments they received were fully tied to what the Scottish Government deemed to be appropriate principles of governance and management. This effectively would be, again, a move to increase state control, and I don't think that that is acceptable to the sector. Convener, if I just may finish on the question of governance in general, I do understand some of the concerns which have been raised, but I do not believe that there are significant problems which somehow have a detrimental effect on education in the university sector. Indeed, no witnesses could provide evidence to prove that the governance structures at present were having a detrimental effect on the education delivered. And it's for that reason that I'm very nervous, and my party is very nervous, about pursuing amendments that restrict the democratic choices of staff and students when it comes to that governance. That's something I think that we would have to look at extremely carefully if we were going to pursue it. I think it would be something that would harm the university sector And that is the comments that have come obviously to us from those who are involved in the new Code of Governance.
Thank you. Can I call the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 7 and other amendments in the group? Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 7 would change the proposed new Section 9A of the Further and Higher Education Scotland Act 2005 by transferring from ministers to the Funding Council the power to identify the principles of good governance with which institutions must comply. Ministers would retain the ability to impose a condition of grant on the Council that they must require institutions to comply with principles of good governance, but the amendment would mean that it was a matter for the Council rather than ministers to determine what those principles are. Now, this amendment, and there will be others similar to it during the process of Stage 2, does address, I think, the concern that Liz Smith has just alluded to. There has been no intention to interfere in the responsible autonomy of universities, though there will always be a series of different definitions about the word responsible, the word autonomy, and how they're linked together. But we've made clear, and I've made clear throughout the process, that it's intention for governance to be improved but not to be interfered with. I've listened carefully to those concerns from members of the committee and from in wider evidence. Amendment 7 strikes the appropriate balance between respecting the sector's autonomy from ministers while also delivering an appropriate level of assurance, what is a very significant level of public funding. In that spirit, I'm also happy to support Amendment 12 that's just been spoken to and lodged by Liz Smith, and to remove the term management from the proposed new section. The university sector have expressed concerns about the word management. They have expressed concerns that this would allow ministers to interfere in the day-to-day operation of institutions. That was never the intention. It would clearly be undesirable. The term was included historically from the 2005 Act, but also with the intention of capturing the kinds of high-level strategic management issues that are more akin to governance than what is ordinarily understood by the term management. But again, I've listened carefully to the sector's concerns and to this committee. We accept that we should not take any risk in this matter, and if there is a view that this is could interfere, then we should drop it, and I'm glad to do so. I do support the principle underlying Amendment 23. It is right and proper that the Funding Council should consult with staff and students in exercising the functions of new Section 9A. Indeed, I've made the case for extensive consultation on the current code being developed by the university chairs throughout the process, and I will be bringing forward amendments to a range of items in the bill that strengthen the position of consultation. And the need for consultation is particularly clear should the committee vote in favour of Amendment 7, which would confer the power to identify what constitutes principles of good governance from ministers to the Council. And the Council would benefit from making sure that it consults widely. But whilst I have no problem with the objective, I don't think this amendment to the bill is necessary for its achievement. Consultation on the development of a revised code would be a critical part of any future development in this area. But as the provisions in the bill do not set out any parameters for developing such a code, in this instance I don't believe a more explicit consultation duty is required or desirable. My clear expectation, and indeed I have said this to the committee before and to this chamber and confirm it here, is that any governance code must be developed by sector leaders working closely with staff, students and all other interested parties. The level of consultation undertaking in developing a code will be one of many factors that the Funding Council would look at in determining whether any future code was accepted as good practice in the future, and the existing powers of the 2005 Act already enable the Council to consult on such matters. So I would invite the committee to support Amendment 7. I would also invite the committee to support Amendment 12. I would urge Neil Findlay to withdraw Amendment 23 on the grounds that this is covered adequately elsewhere and that the full spirit of the bill supports this.
Thank you. Can I call Neil Findlay to speak to Amendment 23 and other amendments in the group?
Thanks very much, Convener. I would support Amendment 12 and 17 for the reasons set by Liz Smith and, 7 by the Cabinet Secretary. Amendment 23 seeks to ensure that there is a duty on the Funding Council to consult when developing the principles of good governance. This would mean consultation with the very stakeholders who make our higher education institutions the success that they are, namely the relevant staff through their trade unions, students, the business community and the other appropriate stakeholders. Throughout this bill we have heard about problems between these groups and a lack of consultation in developing, or indeed some problems with consultation in developing the current code, and this would go some way to resolving these problems and ensuring consultation takes place when the principles of good governance are developed, amended or changed. By explicitly referring to this in the bill, we would make it clear that we are serious about these issues, and I would certainly
seek to press the amendment.
Thank you. Can I ask any other members who wish to speak to please indicate, and can I begin by calling Liam MacArthur?
Thank you, Convener. In relation to Amendment 12, this looks relatively minor, but I think it's nonetheless an important improvement in providing reassurance about the limitations on the scope of the potential interference in the running of our higher education institutions. Certainly welcome the Cabinet Secretary's indication that he will be supporting the amendment, and in turn let me say that I will be supporting Amendment 7. Colleagues and the Cabinet Secretary will be aware of concerns I've had from the outset about the extent to which this bill increases the scope of powers of ministers to meddle in too many aspects of the way in which our universities and colleges function. In many respects, those concerns remain. However, I welcome this important self-denying ordinance on the part of Mr Russell, which I think improves Section 2 of the bill. It makes clear that higher education institutions will be required to comply with the standards of good governance, as Cabinet Secretary indicated, as a condition of grant, but in a way that better reflects the principle that, as Liz Smith indicated, that universities should not be the subject of political direction. In relation to Amendment 23, last week we obviously heard from Lord Smith and from Simon Pepper defending the draft code of governance that's been produced and also the process given rise to it. However, I think it was also accepted that both the draft code can and must be improved before it's finally agreed, and also that lessons need to be learned about the way in which revisions may be made to that code in future. And like the Cabinet Secretary, I would certainly expect that to be the case. So while I sympathise with the frustrations that have given rise to Neil Findlay's amendment, I think they're ones we all share, I'm not inclined at this stage to support Amendment 23. Thank you.
Okay, can I call George Adam?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I'd just like to also back Liz Smith's Amendment 12. After some of the evidence sessions that we've had, it's become quite clear that there could be, from the university sector's discussions and the evidence, that there could be future Cabinet Secretaries or Ministers who may want to tinker in day-to-day management, and obviously knowing the current Cabinet Secretary, that'd be the furthest thing from his mind. He's a busy individual. But I think for the future, to future-proof it, I think it probably is the best bet at this stage. I can understand why the term management was used initially, in order to make sure that we could capture a high-level strategic management within the whole process. But I think it's quite important as well that this is taken at this stage, so that it can be future-proofed and we don't have any misunderstandings further down the line.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other members who wish to... Sorry, Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. It was just specifically in Amendment 23. While I share Liam MacArthur's concerns, I think the evidence from Professor von Prondinsky was absolutely clear in that we want a more inclusive system of operation, and I think the evidence given the Cabinet Secretary to say that this is unnecessary at this stage, because the Funding Council will have it will require the Funding Council to collaborate with a wide range of bodies in the exercise of its functions, indeed a list that's wider than the proposed amendment, and I think that we should take that as being the position that it's an unnecessary amendment at this stage.
Thank you. If there are no other members who wish to contribute at this stage, I'll just make a short contribution. I very much agree with the comments of Liam MacArthur with regard to the three amendments in this group. I certainly support Amendment 12 for the reasons that Liz Smith laid out very eloquently in moving the amendment, and certainly I support the Amendment 7 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. I think this is a welcome move, so that the SFC are responsible for identifying principles of good governance. And as said again by the Cabinet Secretary and Liam MacArthur, I think we have learned a lot about the consultation process up to now in terms of the code, but I think I too agree that certainly at this stage Amendment 23 is unnecessary. Can I call on Liz Smith to wind up and press or withdraw her amendment?
Thank you, Convener, and can I thank both the Cabinet Secretary and members of the committee for the support for Amendment 12. I do think there's a very important balance to be struck, and it is captured in the phrase responsible autonomy, even if the definitions may be slightly difficult. They do have to account very clearly for a large sum of public money, but at the same time, I think leaving the word management in was contentious on the basis that it could involve interference in the day-to-day running, and that was something that I think is totally unacceptable, not only to the sector, but I actually think it's unacceptable for lots of different reasons across social and economic changes in Scotland. It is very clear to me from the evidence that we've had over a long period of time that the greatest success of the Scottish universities is that responsible autonomy, which I think over time has improved. And I also believe that I think the strength of the university sector lies in its flexibility, which is something that I don't think we should be in any doubt is an extremely important part of the way that Scottish universities are able, as I say, to maintain their very outstanding record that they have, not just in the UK, but across the international community. So I think it's a very important change. I'm very pleased that the committee has agreed to that. I'm happy to support Amendment 7 on the basis that I think that the temptation for ministers to interfere in some of the decisions has been removed, or at least reduced perhaps is more accurate. That is welcome. May I return to the question about Amendment 23? On the question of governance, I am nervous about writing too much onto the face of the bill that could be very restrictive and therefore hinder some of the flexibilities within governance. I think there are issues about how students and staff would be able to act when it came to some of the democratic decisions that are required. I think that's something that can be addressed in the new code, so I'm not inclined to support Amendment 23.
Could I ask you just to formally move your amendment?
And I will be very happy to propose Amendment 12.
12. Thank you. The question is that Amendment 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Agreed. That amendment is agreed to. Can I call Amendment 7 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 12? Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. The question is that Section 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Can I now call Amendment 13 in the name of Jenny Mara in a group on its own? Jenny Mara is not present, and I understand that Neil Findlay will move and speak to the amendment. Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, unfortunately, Jenny Mara is stuck in the Justice Committee at the moment, so I will move this amendment in her name. Less than a year ago, Scottish Labour led a debate on introducing gender quotas for all public bodies because of the chronic underrepresentation of women on them. The debate mentioned von Brunzinski's recommendation to improve the situation in university governing bodies, and we were very supportive of that. At the time, and I don't think much has changed, the debate around the gender breakdown on university courts, the situation at the moment is not, has not improved greatly. If we look at the numbers at the moment, for example, University of Aberdeen, there are 20 men and there was 5 women on the court. The Scottish Agricultural College, there are 14 men, 1 woman, and the numbers are very, very low indeed. Only the Glasgow School of Art appears to have a majority of women on the court. So there's clearly a problem in this regard. In the report from Ferdinand von Brunzinski, he said, we made the recommendation because practice within the sector is pretty uneven. Some universities perform better than others on gender balance and diversity in governing bodies, and some universities could perform much better. I came to Aberdeen from Ireland, where there was a statutory obligation to have a 40% gender balance in governing bodies. That system worked well. As part of gaining confidence of wider society, it is important for universities to show that the composition of their governing bodies reflects that of society. Clearly, we're not doing that if a few women, and occasionally none, are on such governing bodies. I stand by the recommendation that we made. He also refers to his work in Ireland, where that approach succeeded, and I think we do need to reflect on the boards of governing bodies, the society that they serve. Professor von Brunzinski believes it could be achieved, and we believe it could be achieved as well. Therefore, I would certainly press Jenny Mara's motion. Amendment, sorry.
Thank you very much. Call Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. I find myself agreeing almost completely with Mr Finlay, quite an unusual situation for me to be in, with one differing respect. We do not have constitutional competence within the Scotland Act for equalities issues, and I believe that this being put on the face of the bill would make it a problem in terms of the bill being actually compliant with the Scotland Act. And while I fully support Jenny Mara and the Labour Party in seeking to address some of the gender imbalance, I don't think this is the way to do it at this stage.
Thank you. Call Liam MacArthur.
I referred to the evidence we received last week, and I think this is one of the areas where it was acknowledged that the performance of our university governing bodies needs to improve significantly, is in terms of the diversity of their makeup. Lord Smith, I think, was unequivocal in setting out his expectations about what needs to happen over the next few years, and Simon Pepper likewise pointed to the compulsory nature of the Code of Governance and what he felt would be, quote, a major shift in the culture of governing bodies in Scotland. Both, of course, argued that the process should be allowed time to happen once the new code is in place, but I think there will be a general scepticism that without more radical measures, excuses can always be found to do either the bare minimum, if anything, at all. That's why I think Jenny Mara's amendment is very helpful. While I share some of the anxieties about how such a quota system might operate, not least in terms of how it would reflect the multi-year appointments and composition of existing bodies, I'm in no doubt at all that this is an area where drift and dither cannot be allowed to happen. I think Amendment 13 offers an opportunity for Parliament to make clear our expectations about what is required to be achieved to achieve the sort of diverse and representative reflection of the talents we wish to see governing our higher education institutions. As I say, I do have some concerns about the way in which such a quota system might work. I'll listen carefully to what the Cabinet Secretary has to say. However, the benefit of Jenny Mara lodging this at stage 2 is that there is a little time to see if and how this might be made to work. Even if Parliament doesn't accept it at this stage, however, I think it will provide an unambiguous signal to the sector. As Simon Pepper acknowledged last week, quote, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. What's abundantly clear is the ingredients in that pudding need to change significantly.
Call Smith.
Thank you, Convener. I too share the general tone that I think it's an important issue that has to be raised, because it's quite clear that in some universities, but by no means all, there is a significant issue. I have to say I'm very nervous about a 40% target for a quota. I don't think that's helpful for a variety of different reasons. University Scotland themselves made plain why that could be, in fact, actually restrictive with some unintended consequences. I think that would be unhelpful. Like Liam MacArthur, I feel that the new Code of Governance will have a shift of culture, and that for me is important. So I will not be supporting the Amendment 13.
Thank you. No other members wish to speak. Can I call the Cabinet Secretary?
Well, I would very much want to thank Jenny Mara for laying this amendment for Mr Finlay for moving it. I know during the evidence sessions that the committee heard a number of concerns about the lack of diversity in university governing bodies, and they're valid concerns which I entirely share. And indeed, I said so at stage 1 of the bill and said I would come forward with further thoughts on it. The governing bodies of universities and indeed colleges must properly reflect society and institutions they govern. There's only one college body, I think, that has a majority of women on it, and that is Kilmarnock College. I stand to be corrected if you want to look at the full detail, but I think Mr Finlay is also right to say there's only Glasgow School of Art that comes anywhere close to having any sort of balance. And some of the courts of the universities are really disgraceful in that regard, and I think the universities themselves are beginning to accept it. Overall, the representation in this sector is around 30%. We should and we must do better. Now, it's something I've made clear to the university sector in my discussions on the Code of Governance, which I believe Lord Smith referred to last week. I hope to see the area developed in any redrafted code. It's something I will now reflect in my guidance to colleges around appointments in future. Now, Jenny Mara tabled similar amendment to recent bills on police and fire reform and civil justice. These were rejected. But we've since considered this matter in some considerable detail, and whilst I cannot support this amendment as it stands today, I am supportive of trying to bring forward something that reflects the principle behind it. We've explored the feasibility of an approach such as Jenny Mara suggests, and there are a number of serious legal issues which we have to consider further. And Claire Adamson is right to say, in particular, equal opportunities are, unfortunately, a reserved matter. We think that the provision of setting absolute quotas for membership of men and women of a governing body would not be within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. If the bill was to include such a clause, then the bill itself would be ultra vires, and that creates great difficulties. But it is something I want to explore further over the coming weeks with the Minister for the Commonwealth Games and Sport, who has responsibility for equality issues. And I would encourage Jenny Mara and other members to come forward and to discuss that with the ministers. And there will be a willingness to have that discussion so that we can find an amendment at stage 3 that keeps us within devolved competence, alas, but will signal our very clear intention to see that progress is made in improving diversity and equality in the governance structures. I think we've moved a considerable distance over the last few months on this issue. I would urge Neil Findlay not to press this amendment at this stage, but I would urge him and Jenny Mara and other members of the committee to enter into that dialogue, because there is a sincere intention of putting into the bill something that is legal. Unfortunately, this particular amendment would not be competent. But we are desperate and desperately keen to find the right method to do this, because what we have is not good enough.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Can I call Neil Findlay to wind up and to indicate whether he wishes to press or withdraw his amendment?
I would wish to press the amendment, Convener. We will, of course, engage with the Cabinet Secretary should it not proceed. I would just like to quote Professor von Brzezinski, who, when asked about this, I think it was by John McAlpine, said that it would depend on how particular provision was framed. For example, if legislation was introduced that indicated that gender-based decisions would have to be made in relation to particular positions on a government body, that would be a problem, and I suspect it would not succeed. However, if a statutory obligation was placed on governing bodies to maintain an overall gender balance, not specific to any particular appointment to the governing body, my advice would be that that would be in line with the legal framework. So I would certainly seek to press the amendment.
Okay, thank you. The question is that Amendment 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not all agreed. There will be a vote. Therefore, can members please indicate those who are in favour of Amendment 13? Those who are against? And are any abstentions? The result of the vote on Amendment 13 is for the Amendment 2, against 5, and there were no abstentions. The amendment is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 1 in the name of Liam MacArthur, grouped with Amendments 14, 15, 2, 3, 16, 4, 19, 5, 28, 21, 60, 61 and 6. Can I also point out that if Amendment 1 is agreed to, you cannot call, I cannot call Amendments 14 and 15 because of a preemption. Can I call Liam MacArthur to move Amendment 1 and speak to all amendments in the group? Liam
Thank
MacArthur.
you, Convener. I'm happy to move and speak to Amendment 1 while also touching on the other amendments in this group, and I apologise in advance for taking a little time to do so given the number of amendments in this grouping. Convener, there were many disagreements at stage 1 about a whole range of different issues. In the end, that resulted in the government being unable to persuade any but their own that this bill would be able, or in fact necessary, to achieve the lofty ambitions set it. However, you will recall that the committee was united in supporting the general policy objectives, primary amongst them the need to accelerate and indeed extend the process of widening access to our higher education institutions. There seemed to be acceptance of this consensus by the Cabinet Secretary during the Stage 1 debate, at least in his opening remarks. However, I do believe there is a broad-based and genuine consensus on this issue, and with good reason. Few would dispute, for example, that while some progress has been made in extending access, this has been painfully slow and from a base that is hardly a beacon of progressiveness either in these islands, let alone internationally. So much more needs to be done, with some institutions rightly under more pressure than others to up their game. Of course, progress can only be achieved with universities working closely in collaboration with colleges, schools and other partners, but rightly the onus will be on universities to demonstrate that progress is indeed being made. But how do we help achieve this? For my part, I still believe the funding levers at the disposal of ministers through the Funding Council provide the most persuasive and effective tool Using these in conjunction with beefed up access agreements, I struggle to see what more is achieved through the statutory powers being sought by Mr Russell. However, recognising the parliamentary arithmetic, I believe it's important that we make these provisions as workable as possible, reflecting the evidence we heard at stage 1. In that regard, amendments 1 to 5 make a number of important changes which I hope colleagues will support, although I appreciate Neil Findlay, Joan McAlpine and Mark Griffin have sought through different means to try to achieve similar outcomes in certain respects. One concern we had at stage 1 was that the government's approach to widening access laid too much emphasis on the social index of multiple deprivation. And while critically important, this seemed to be, to the committee to risk overlooking those from deprived backgrounds living in more affluent areas, as well as other underrepresented groups, a point made forcibly in the letter to the Scottish Government last month from 12 charities representing a wide range of those groups. My amendments make the new power specific to widening access agreements, as well as clarifying the respective roles of the Minister, the Funding Council and individual institutions. They make the institution, rather than the Funding Council, the initiator in proposing the content of access agreements, reflecting best practice, but certainly not diminishing the potential for the Council to agree only to those agreements that it believes are sufficiently rigorous and ambitious. Finally, in relation to the amendments in my name, and before turning to those of colleagues, can I say a little about Amendment 61? Well, I appreciate the Minister and the sector may feel that there is already an ample body of research and other evidence to inform widening access agreements and determine what is and is not likely to work most effectively. Nevertheless, in light of the glacially slow progress that has been made in this area over the years, I think an argument can be made for saying that good practice is either not being shared as widely as it should, or is perhaps not as good as we might imagine. Either way, my Amendment 61 seeks to redress this apparent shortcoming. In terms of colleagues' amendments in this group, I appreciate that Neil Findlay is motivated by very much the same concerns, is also seeking to protect the interests of underrepresented groups, albeit in a more explicit fashion. I can see some problems with such a prescriptive approach, but we'll listen to what he and the Minister have to say before making my mind up on those amendments. So I recognise that my Amendment 1 will preempt Mr Findlay's Amendment 14 and Mark Griffin's Amendment 15. Similarly, Joan McAlpine's Amendment 8 seems to have the same policy intention as some of the early changes I've proposed, but perhaps not allow enough flexibility in ensuring that different access agreements reflect the needs and deficiencies of specific institutions. And finally, Marco Biagi's Amendment 60, well, again, one with which I have a great deal of sympathy, not least in its acknowledgement of the need for collaboration between universities and colleges in achieving meaningful improvements in widening access, does appear to ignore or at least downplay the role of the school sector, if nothing else, in helping raise the ambition and the expectations of those we wish to see going on to university in greater numbers. Convener, I apologise for the fact that I've gone on at length on this group of amendments. I will attempt to make up for that in future groupings. However, I think this is a crucial area of the bill and one where I think we're some way yet from getting it right. And again, I move Amendment number 1 in my name.
Thank you very much, Ms MacArthur. Can I call Neil Findlay to speak to Amendment 14 and other amendments in the group?
Thanks very much, Convener. 14 and 16, Chair, whilst we see Amendment 1 as an improvement on what is in the bill, Amendment 14 seeks to widen out access and add those with protected characteristics to the SIMD 20 group, so we want to widen access further. This amendment would encourage increase participation of a range of people covered by the 2010 Act, which refers to age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. The amendment is supported by a range of disability groups who have been very active in this area, and by the NUS and others. We know that disabled people in particular struggle to access higher education, and when they do access it, they have difficulty completing their studies. Widening access should be about what it says on the tin, and these groups added to the SIMD 20 group would assist particularly disabled people access and complete courses. Amendments 16, 19, 20 and 21 seek to maintain the consistency throughout the section, and 21 clarifies the protected characteristics I have referred to and refers to the relevant Act, namely Section 4 of the Equality Act 2010. We need to ensure that widening access happens in all our institutions, and that we don't simply have the usual excuses trotted out for failure.
Thank you. Can I call Mark Griffin to speak to Amendment 15 and other amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener. I agree with a lot of the points that Lee MacArthur made on Amendment 1, and so would be supporting Amendment 1. In the event that that would fall, I would be continuing to press Amendment 15, simply because in the section of widening access to higher education, feel that the access agreement should be drafted by the institution, and that the Scottish ministers should approve that draft rather than specifying the draft themselves. So that would be why I'd be moving Amendment 15.
Thank you. Can I call Joan McAlpine to speak to Amendment 8 and other amendments in the group? Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Convener. I regard widening access section of the bill as a very important step on the road to making some much needed progress on this issue. But as I listened to Stage 1 evidence, it seemed clear to me that there was often an interpretation that the provisions in Section 3 would target only those captured by the SIMD measure. I wholeheartedly agree with those who thought that to be successful, the provisions had to be wider than that. The purpose of my amendment is to make absolutely clear that the provisions allow ministers to identify any group of people sharing a social or economic characteristic that's underrepresented to be the focus of efforts to increase participation. I believe that providing this clarification will help ease the minds of stakeholders who are concerned about the limitations of the SIMD measure. On Mr Finlay's amendments, I understand the approach being proposed by Mr Finlay to extend the definitions here to protect all characteristics. While I support the principle behind this, I do not think it's appropriate in this section of the bill, and I move Amendment 8 in my name.
Thank you very much. Can I call Marco Biagi to speak to Amendment 60 and other amendments in the group? Marco.
Thank you, Convener. Can I say it's good to be back, however briefly. Amendment 60 draws from the discussions that have been had about the need to provide support to best practice in widening access. While there have been calls from certain stakeholder organisations to create a widening access unit, whether in statute or otherwise, there's an independent body along the lines of the English equivalent, that I would feel would be unnecessary in Scotland as a result of that English equivalent having been set up as a result of £9,000 per year tuition fees that we do not have here. However, there is value, as Liam MacArthur has touched on, in having that body of research and evidence. And so rather than establishing an entirely new quango, I would propose in this amendment that the Scottish Funding Council should take on board that duty. The Scottish Funding Council is established, it is respected, it is independent. And in the current 2005 Act setting out its roles, there are 3 key aims that are set out: teaching, research, coherent system of higher education. But Section 20, which my amendment seeks to amend, states that it is entitled Council to have regard to particular matters, and it includes a long list of issues that the Council has to take into consideration in its activities. This includes skill needs in Scotland, issues affecting the economy of Scotland, social and cultural issues in Scotland, sustainable development, the UK and international context, and educational and related needs. I therefore think that would be an appropriate place to similarly add widening access. And Part B of my amendment also draws on the language that has already been used in the National Library of Scotland Bill in giving the National Library of Scotland a duty to promote collaboration and knowledge sharing within its sector.
Thank you very much. Do any other members wish to contribute at this stage? Liz Smith.
Thank you, Convener. Could I once again put on record the Scottish Conservative support for the principle of widening access, something which we believe is important not just for intrinsic educational reasons but also for social and economic reasons, and I think our parliamentary record substantiates that claim. We do, however, differ very considerably in our views about how widening access is best achieved. The last thing that we consider desirable or indeed necessary is greater stipulation about which groups should be offered places. In particular, we fail to see why there has to be a legislative underpinning when it is very clear that the university sector believes that the outcome agreements can work just as well. Indeed, I think they are already doing so. We have sympathy for the amendments that have been moved by Liam MacArthur, numbers 1 to 5. To say I have slight reservations about Amendment 61 in that aspect. I also have some sympathy with some of the concerns that have been expressed about narrowing the measures. The SIMD 20 and 40 measures, I think, are far too narrow, and that we've taken on board a lot of what has been said on that basis. However, I think some of the other amendments are unduly over-prescriptive policies, which I think very much would have unintended consequences. I believe that these could be detrimental to the flexibility of universities, and I also think they could lead to very considerable bureaucratic legislation in the future. And so on that basis, I will not be supporting these other amendments.
Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Widening access, I think, is one of the most important parts of this bill, and I don't think anybody around this table would disagree the social and economic imperatives that drive that. And I think that a lot of these amendments are perhaps driven by a commendable intention. However, I have concerns that some of these amendments effectively dilute or water down the effective implementation of widening access and, in some cases, constrain choices. If I look at Amendment 1, the effect of the amendment really is to remove the ability of the ministers to set any widening access agenda in terms of identifying socio-economic groups which are underrepresented, on which these widening access efforts could be focused. And it would be a question of how to target these people. And I don't think this. I think this amendment puts too many constraints on the government. Amendment 15 it reduces the role of ministers and determine what an access agreement would look like, since the ministers must approve a description of any such agreement, and it's not clear at what stage ministers would approve a description of the agreement. There's vagueness here, and Amendment 2 goes a bit further than simply clarifying that agreements are negotiated. It puts the institutions concerned into the driving seat and allows them to submit proposals to the SFC on what actions they should take. So the role of the SFC would be somewhat diminished to reaching agreement on proposals, rather than taking a proactive role in specifying to institutions what should be achieved. And if we look at Amendments 3, 4 and 5, these appear to be an attempt to deal with concerns about focusing on postcode areas. But the amendments might avoid that, but the expense would be that the provisions wouldn't be focused on any particular group at all. And the difficulty with that approach is it makes it very difficult to explicitly to target specific unrepresented groups. Amendment 8 from Joan McAlpin I would certainly support. Amendments 14, 16, 19, 20 and 21, there seem to be some concerns as to whether these amendments are actually within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament, since equal opportunities are actually reserved. And they also bring in the concept of persons with a protected characteristic, which seems to me to be diluting the widening access provisions that the bill is trying to put forward. As things stand, Section 3 is targeted at increasing participation amongst those who are most underrepresented, and that's people from deprived socio-economic background. And I think, given the fact that there's questions about whether these amendments are within the legislative competence, and also this question of diluting widening access itself, I certainly would not support these amendments. Amendment 6, it looks to be a sort of technical amendment. I'm not really clear why that amendment's necessary, and I don't think that's been clearly explained why it is necessary. Amendment 60, Marco Biaggi, I certainly support. Amendment 60, again, this appears to it's much narrower in scope than Amendment 60, in that it provides only for certain work to be undertaken, presumably by a specific person or group, rather than the broader principle, and very importantly, of encouraging general collaboration across the tertiary education centre that's outlined in Amendment 60. So I don't think this amendment works, and I certainly wouldn't support it.
Thank you. Can I call George Adam?
Thank you, Convener. I have some, I back a lot of what my colleague Colin Beattie's already mentioned, because with Neil Finlay's amendments, I do have concerns that they might dilute the primary focus of trying to get people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I say that because it's a sheer emotional thing for me, because I have the constituency that has the council ward that does have the area, the lowest, the area of the multiple deprivation at the bottom of the list, and within that area, I think we should have the opportunity for these young people to actually be everything they can be in life, and education can be the pathway out of poverty for many of these people. And for me, this is the most important part of this whole bill, because I think the kind of Scotland we want, we may argue here all day about the type of Scotland we want in the future, but we want what's best for our constituents and for the young people in Scotland. And I think we have to go down this line of not diluting the idea of being able to get people like from Fergusley Park in Paisley the opportunity to get access to higher education.
Okay, thank you very much. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I just wanted to reflect the comments already made about how the intentions are very clear from the people that have moved amendments. However, I will support John McAlpine's amendment, because I think that gives clear flexibility to the Minister and actually really driving the widening access agenda. And if I give a specific example from experience on the Equal Opportunities Committee, is if we take, for instance, gypsy travellers, they are not a protected characteristic. They wouldn't fall into any of these areas, but that's obviously an area where they are underrepresented. And this would give the Cabinet Secretary an opportunity to maybe look at some of those areas. So I think flexibility is key to this.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I call the Cabinet Secretary?
Thank you, Convener. Obviously, this is a very important area. It's right that it is debated at some length, and indeed all the amendments seek to bring new thinking to the debate. But clearly, at the end of the day, there has to be a decision about how we do widen access, and that is against the backdrop of a failure to make the progress that society, I believe, in Scotland has wanted to make for many years. So we have to have absolute clarity about what we're going to achieve. Now, to go through those amendments, Convener, as briefly as I can, the cumulative effect of Amendment 1 is to actually restrict the roles and powers of ministers in relating to wider access. The amendment would only allow ministers to impose a condition on the Council to require institutions to comply, that all the other powers would be negated. And the amendment would remove the ability of ministers to identify particular groups in respect of which efforts to increase participation should be focused. And in a similar vein, Amendments 15 and 2 diminish the role of ministers in determining what a widening access agreement should look like. Indeed, Amendment 2, by removing the Funding Council's power to specify the actions institutions need to take, puts institutions in the driving seat when it comes to develop widening access agreements. Now, I regard 1, 15 and 2 as clearly undesirable. I believe they would substantially diminish the effectiveness of the new section. Members perhaps might want to reflect that the lack of progress in this area over the last decade means it is essential that someone drives the widening access agenda faster than the institutions have driven it themselves. And it is right that ministers should be the ones to do that. The status quo, as we have it now, has not delivered any significant improvements to access in the last 10 years. So a new approach with a greater level of challenge is essential to drive progress. What Liam MacArthur proposes with Amendment 2 appears to be some form of self-regulation, where institutions decide for themselves what should be done and simply require the SFC to sign off on those proposals. That is not good enough. Amendments 3, 4 and 5 appear to be targeted at focusing Section 3 on individuals rather than groups, and I accept there's some merit in that idea. It's important that the provisions are flexible enough to not exclude individuals we would wish the provisions to help, but who do not readily fit into typical socio-economic groups. But the difficulty with these amendments is that they then go too far the other way. The focus would be only on individuals, meaning that widening access agreements could not identify and target priority groups in which participation was low. Now, Amendment 8, actually lodged by Joan McAlpine, achieves similar aims, but without those difficulties. The amendment does provide a helpful clarification that the widening access provisions are not intended to focus solely on people who are captured by the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, important as that measure undoubtedly is. The amendment makes explicit that ministers can require the Council to focus on any group who share a social or economic characteristic and who are underrepresented in higher education, the point that Claire Adamson has, I think, made well. This makes clear that the scope of the provisions may extend beyond groups geographically defined by SIMD to capture, for example, people with low incomes, even if they reside in more affluent areas, and other groups. So I'm happy to support amendment number 8 in Joan McAlpine's name. Now, when I go on to the further amendments, I thank Neil Findlay for lodging the amendments 14, 16, 19, 20 and 21. It allows us to have this important and wide discussion. I strongly support the principle that those with protected characteristics should be adequately represented in our higher education sector, and I believe this bill does so. But there are certain difficulties with the amendments. Equal opportunities are a reserved matter. We've just discussed in relation to gender equalities. As such, there will be, I suspect, real issues with the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament to legislate in this area. But I think there are also policy reasons for not supporting these amendments. The new Section 9B being inserted into the 2005 Act has a sharp focus on the people who most need our help to access higher education, people from deprived socio-economic backgrounds. All of the evidence which we have clearly demonstrates this is the area where Scotland's problems with access primarily lies in. It's therefore right that the emphasis in the bill should be on those people who need our help most. There is a risk that by significantly extending the groups, in a way that Amendment 8 doesn't, to be captured by the provision dilutes the effectiveness of our primary policy objective, to get people from deprived backgrounds into higher education. Amendment 6 seeks to remove an amendment to the 2005 Act by the bill which makes clear ministers cannot impose terms and conditions on the Funding Council relating to the admission of students, except where they're doing so in terms of the widening access provisions. The effect of the amendment, however, would be to prevent ministers from exercising their powers in relation to widening access under the whole Section 9B1 and 9B2. And that's consistent with the overall approach that Liam MacArthur's amendments have taken, but is inconsistent with the approach, I believe, not only we're committed to, but we need to take. Amendments 60 and 61 appear similar, but there are fundamental differences between them. The principles underlying Amendment 60 are consistent with the prominence we're seeking to place on the issue of widening access and the significant progress we need to see. Establishing widening access as one of the key matters which the Funding Council must have regard to in the exercise of its functions will help us to achieve that progress. I think that widening access would sit rather neatly with the other key matters set out in Section 20 of the 2005 Act, which the Council must have regard: skills needs, issues affecting the economy and social and cultural issues in Scotland, as well as the education and related needs of students. However, there are some technical issues with Amendment 60 that require to be ironed out. It doesn't make clear whether it is ministers or the Council who are to identify the particular socio-economic groups the duty is related to. In addition, if the amendment is to relate to further education, then it should probably also capture collaboration with or between regional strategic bodies. And there are some issues regarding consistency with the general duty to encourage collaboration placed in the Council by Section 22.8 of the 2005 Act that require to be considered. So regarding Liam MacArthur's amendment, I don't necessarily object to the principle, but Liam MacArthur's amendment in practice is narrower in scope than Amendment 60. Amendment 61 simply provides for the Funding Council to ensure that the work is done in relation to developing. I assume that work would be done by a specific person or group rather than the broader principle of the Council promoting collaboration, but it's not clear. And Amendment 61 could also be interpreted as something broadly similar to the functions discharged by the Office for Fair Access in England. And the Office for Fair Access in England exists to mitigate the difficulties caused by the introduction of tuition fees. That is not a problem that exists in Scotland. So I would invite the committee to reject Amendments 1, 15, 2, 14, 16, 19, 20, 21, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 61. I would invite the committee to support Amendment 8. With regard to Amendment 60, I would ask Marco Biaggi to withdraw it at this stage, on the understanding that I will return with a similar amendment at stage 3. And of course I'm happy to discuss the matter with him as we develop that amendment.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Can I call Liam MacArthur to wind up and indicate whether he wishes to press or withdraw Amendment 1?
Thank you, Convener. I'm conscious that I've probably had more opportunity to speak on this grouping of amendments than I get in some debates in the Chamber, but anyway, I'll try and keep it as brief as I can. In relation to Neil Findlay's amendments, as I indicated earlier, I certainly appreciate what Neil Findlay's looking to achieve, and he's absolutely right in terms of the range of underrepresented groups that whose interests must be uppermost in our minds as we take forward the provisions in this element of the bill, though I think I share some of the concerns about the prescriptive nature of the amendments as they're currently drafted. Mark Griffin, I'd thank him for his support for my amendment. I can return the compliment in the unlikely event of either of our amendments passing. We will be in uncharted territory there, I suspect. Joe McAlpine, again, right in terms of the evidence that we heard at stage 1 that what the bill failed to capture was the broader range of underrepresented groups that needed to be addressed as part of the widening access agenda, and I will be happy to support that amendment in due course. Marco Biaggi, it's certainly good to have him back as well. I think that during the earlier part of this year, during flight delays affecting my constituency, his attendance record at this committee was better than my own. I think in terms of his amendment 60, however, I've a great deal of sympathy with that. As again I said in my earlier remarks, I have some concerns about the extent to which it does seem to gloss over the role that the school sector has in terms of promoting the widening access agenda. That may be something that can also be picked up as the amendment is developed ahead of stage 3. I thank Liz Smith for her comments. I share her concerns in terms of the legislative underpinning that is felt to be necessary to these provisions, although I do think at this stage there is scant evidence yet that the access agreements are having the effect that we would all wish to see. Nevertheless, I think those funding levers remain critical in ensuring progress is made. Colin Beattie referred in disparaging terms to putting universities in the driving seat in terms of access agreements. I have no objection to having universities in the driving seat, albeit with the Funding Council having oversight and only agreeing to those access agreements that are robust, rigorous and ambitious enough to meet our objectives. George Adam is absolutely right that we should not lose sight in terms of widening out the scope of the widening access provisions. We should not lose sight of the socio-economic factors. And in terms of the Cabinet Secretary's remarks, diminishing the role of ministers, again, he seemed to have an issue with it. It would appear that Amendment 7 and that self-denying ordinance is going to be the exception rather than the rule. He also talked about putting institutions in the driving seat, obviously operating from Colin Beattie's script. He's got the funding levers, I think, to achieve much of what we wish to achieve in this area. I appreciate the concerns he has about my Amendment 61. I will be, I think, inclined not to move that and to throw my support behind the approach taken by Marco Biaggi, but that I think for now covers all of the points raised. And I move Amendment 1.
Thank you very much, Liam. Can I remind members that if Amendment 1 is agreed to, then Amendments 14 and 15 are preempted. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not all agreed. Can I ask members to indicate those who are in favour of Amendment 1? Okay, thank you. Can I ask those who are against Amendment 1 to please indicate? And any abstentions? On Amendment 1, there was 4 votes for, 5 against, no abstentions. Amendment 1 is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 14, the name of Neil Findlay, already debated with Amendment 1, Neil Findlay to move or not move? Amendment 14 is moved. The question is that Amendment 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed. Can members again please indicate those in favour of Amendment 14? Okay. Those against Amendment 14? Any abstentions? Result of the vote on Amendment 14 is 2 votes in favour, 7 against, 0 abstentions. Amendment 14 is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 15 in the name of Mark Griffin, already debated with Amendment 1? Mark Griffin to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
The question is that Amendment 15 we agreed to. We are not agreed, sorry. Can members please indicate those in favour of Amendment 15? Okay. Those against Amendment 15? And no abstention. Result of the vote on Amendment 15 is 3 votes in favour, 6 against. Amendment 15 is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 2 in the name of Liam MacArthur, already debated with Amendment 1? Liam MacArthur to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Members would speak up, it would be helpful. We're not agreed, therefore, can members please indicate those in favour of Amendment 2? Those against? Any abstentions? Result of the vote on Amendment 2 is there are 4 votes for, 5 against. Amendment 2 is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 3 in the name of Liam MacArthur, already debated with Amendment 1? Liam MacArthur to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Amendment 3 is not agreed to. Can those members please indicate who are in favour of Amendment 3? Okay. Those against? Result of the vote on Amendment number 3 is 4 votes for, 5 against. Amendment 3 is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 16 in the name of Neil Findlay, already debated with Amendment 1? Neil Findlay to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Amendment 16, can members please indicate those who support Amendment 16? Those against Amendment 16? Okay, thank you. Any abstentions? No. The result of the vote on Amendment 16 is 2 votes in favour, 7 against. Amendment 16 is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 17 in the name of Marco Biagi, grouped with Amendment 18? Marco Biagi to move Amendment 17 and speak to other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 17 is focused on the process of developing widening access agreements. These are going to be very important agreements for taking forward the direction of travel that we wish to see on widening access. However, it is important that we consider higher education institutions as broad learning communities, and that there will be input from all sectors of that community, including staff, students, and of course the institution's governing body in the development of those agreements. That way we can ensure not only that the widening access agreements are better designed, but also that there is wider ownership within that institution. I think it also includes some of the sense that can be rescued from Liam MacArthur's Amendment 2, in that it ensures consultation with the institution. And I would draw a difference between 17 and 18, which attempts to do broadly the same thing in 2 areas. Firstly, Amendment 17 places the duty to consult on the SFC rather than on the higher education institution in question, which should already have established consultative procedures for the involvement of staff and students. And secondly, Amendment 17 focuses on those trade unions that would be recognised by the Council rather than those that would be recognised by the institution. Given the status of industrial relations, it would probably be better for the long term if the Council approached unions that were generally representative of the student body rather than those that were formally recognised by the institution.
Okay, thank you very much. Mark Griffin to speak to Amendment 18 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 18 works towards the same principles as Amendment 17. I would agree with most of what Mr Biaggi has said. The difference with Amendment 18 is that we believe the focus on drafting that widening access agreement should be with the individual institution rather than with the council, and so it would be the institution's obligation to consult with representative trade unions and the Students' Association, and that's why we'll be pressing Amendment 18.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other members wish to speak? That's great. Cabinet Secretary?
Convener, regarding 17 and 18, I'm happy to support the principle that an element of consultation with staff, students and institutions should be injected into the process of developing widening access agreements. Now, while I support the underlying principle, there's a difficulty with Amendment 18, as it places a duty to consult on the institutions as opposed to the Funding Council when formulating a widening access agreement. While in practice the widening access agreements will be the result of negotiation between the Council and institutions, new Section 9B, as we know from our previous debate that we've just had, makes clear it's ultimately for the Funding Council to specify the actions an institution must take based on those negotiations. It's therefore more appropriate that the duty to consult is placed on the Council, since it is they who have the authority to specify what actions an agreement should contain. Amendment 17, in the name of Marco Biaggi, manages to navigate a course through these difficulties. I'd invite the committee to support that one today. I'd invite the committee to reject Amendment 18.
Thank you very much. Marco Biaggi, can I call you to wind up and to either indicate whether you're going to press or withdraw your amendment?
Intent to move the amendment and press it.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Okay, that's that. No. So there was a no. Okay, can I ask all members who are in favour of Amendment 17 to please indicate? Okay. Those against Amendment 17? And any abstentions? The result of the vote on Amendment 17 is 5 votes in favour, 2 against and 2 abstentions. Amendment 17 therefore is agreed to. Can I call Amendment 18 in the name of Mark Griffin, already debated with Amendment 17. Mark Griffin, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Can members please indicate those in favour of Amendment 18? Those against? And any abstentions? The result of the vote on Amendment number 18 is those in favour 2, those against 7. Amendment 18 is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 4 in the name of Liam MacArthur, already debated with Amendment 1. Liam MacArthur, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not all agreed. Can those members who wish to support Amendment 4 please show? Those against? Sorry. Just repeat your hands down again. We'll start that vote again. Okay. Those in favour of Amendment 4 please show. Okay. Those against? Abstentions? The result of Amendment number 4, the vote on Amendment number 4 is 4 votes in favour, 5 against. Amendment 4 is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 19 in the name of Neil Finlay, already debated with Amendment number 1. Neil Finlay, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 19 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Not agreed. Can members please indicate those in favour of Amendment 19? Okay. Those against? Abstentions? The result of the vote on Amendment number 19 is 2 in favour, 7 against. Amendment 19 is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 5 in the name of Liam MacArthur, already debated with Amendment 1. Liam MacArthur, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No, we are not all agreed. Can I ask members to please indicate those who are supporting Amendment 5? All those against? Abstentions? The result of the vote on amendment number 5, 4 votes in favour, 5 against. Amendment 5 is disagreed to. I call amendment 20 in the name of Neil Findlay, already debated with amendment 1. Neil Findlay, to move or not move? Move. The question is that amendment 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not. Can members please indicate those in favour of amendment 20? Those against? And abstentions. The result of the vote on amendment number 20 is 2 votes in favour, 7 against. Amendment 20 is disagreed to. Can I call amendment 8 in the name of Joan McAlpine, already debated with amendment number 1. Joan McAlpine, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. There's no. Okay. Could those in favour of amendment 8 please show? Those against? Abstentions? Thank you. It's 8. The result of the vote on amendment number 8 is 6 votes in favour, 1 against and 2 abstentions. The amendment is agreed to. Can I call amendment number 21 in the name of Neil Findlay, already debated with amendment 1. Neil Findlay, to move or not move? Move. The question is that amendment 21 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Can I ask those members who are in favour of amendment 21 to please indicate? Okay. All those against? Abstentions? The result of the vote on amendment number 21 were 2 votes in favour, 7 against. Amendment 21 is therefore disagreed to. Can I call now amendment 22 in the name of Marco Biaggi and a group on its own? Marco Biaggi, to move and speak to amendment 22.
Thank you again, Convener. This amendment's aim, this amendment's aim is to ensure that there is a regular review of widening access, first to occur up to 3 years after the bill receives royal assent, and therefore at 3 yearly intervals afterwards. The principle of having regular reviews is very common in legislation. The Graduate Endowment Abolition Act includes a commitment to review the effect it has on widening access, and in others where large-scale changes or major policy initiatives have been undertaken, such reviews are, broadly speaking, commonplace. In Chamber debate on stage 1, there was often a focus on whether widening access agreements would work, and therefore I think based on that concern there is a space for a requirement to produce an analysis at regular intervals that will allow MSPs, stakeholder bodies and all others to take stock of progress thus far. I recognise that there may be technical issues, not least because of the amendments that have already been passed that have affected key terms within this amendment, and move it.
Thank you very much. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much. I welcome this amendment. I think there's no doubt that successive governments have struggled to make the sort of progress we wish to see in terms of widening access, and I think it's a sensible provision, as Marco Biaggi says, to keep under review any legislative changes that we do make in this area. I know that University of Scotland has raised concerns about a statutory provision of this type and whether or not it would duplicate either what happens already or what is set to happen. However, I think with the condition that, again, a little like Amendment 17, I have some concerns that this doesn't necessarily reflect the wider role and responsibility other aspects of the education sector have in delivering against our widening access objectives. Nevertheless, I think the policy intention behind this amendment is one I would support, and subject to further refinement, certainly be happy to vote for it.
Thank you. Can I call Liz Smith?
Thank you, Convener. Whilst I think the policy intention is fine, I have to say I think this is unnecessary because it already happens within the context of the outcome agreements, and I also think that it could be restrictive in the sense that anything about widening access within schools, which I think is perhaps one of the most important policy areas that we have to deal with, would be out with its jurisdiction. So I think this is very restrictive actually, and for that reason I will not be supporting it.
If there are no other members who wish to contribute to this debate, can I call the Cabinet Secretary?
Convener, Amendment 22 does raise important issues. I thank Michael Biaggi for lodging it. The amendment has clear value. The purpose of Section 3 is to empower ministers, when providing funding to the SFC, to impose conditions relating to widening access to higher education for underrepresented socioeconomic groups in order to stimulate what we need, which is substantial progress. It makes sense that we should periodically review whether that progress is in fact being made. Indeed, the importance of rigorously evaluating progress is such that if the question arises of whether we ought to review the position of widening access for all underrepresented groups more expansively. The way that the amendment has been drafted would not, however, require a comprehensive overall review of widening access. Instead, it would place a duty on the Funding Council to review and report at least every 3 years on the impact of the new Section 9B of the 2005 Act, and only that. Now, of course, that's a very important thing to do, but I don't believe it should be the end of the story. A broader review of access could fulfil this function while also assessing the overall national picture. For example, we should ask ourselves, are there groups amongst whom participation is actually falling? Are there emerging priorities? Where should we best focus our efforts and indeed our resources in future? Those are the sort of issues a more general review could tackle, which this proposed review could not tackle. So, having given the matter a lot of consideration, my intention is now to bring forward an amendment at stage 3 which would place a duty on the Funding Council to review access in that more expansive and I think more significant way. So I would ask Marco Biaggi to withdraw it. Am I allowed to take an intervention? I'm willing to take one if... Yes, okay. Happy to.
Breaking with tradition here. You would have heard the point that both myself and Liz Smith made about the kind of wider responsibility within the education sector as a whole to deliver on our widening access objectives, and it's a theme that you've picked up, I think, in a number of debates on this issue. What, in terms of the amendment that you'd be seeking to bring forward at stage 3, would you be able to do in order to kind of capture that wider responsibility?
I'm very happy to take that away as an issue to consider, whether we can capture that, whether the Funding Council's role can be seen as wider than simply dealing with the bodies in which it funds, and whether it could draw in that issue. So I'd be happy to consider that as part of it. What we would end up with this proposal is a narrow review. I think you're quite right, and Liz Smith is quite right to argue that many of the issues of wider access, the origins of them lie elsewhere. I've talked myself about the issues at the school gate that we need to address. So I'm happy to put those into it and to bring those back, if I can, as part of a more comprehensive Stage 3 amendment. And I'd be happy to have conversations about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Marco Biaggi to wind up and to indicate whether he seeks to press or withdraw his amendment.
Well, based on that assurance, I am happy to withdraw.
Our members, do members agree that Amendment 22 can be withdrawn? Yes. Agreed. Thank you. The question is that Section 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Can I call Amendment 23 in the name of Neil Findlay, already debated with Amendment 12? Neil Findlay, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Not all agreed. Can members please indicate those in favour of Amendment 23? Those against? Abstentions? No. The result of the vote on amendment number 23, 2 votes in favour, 7 against. Amendment 23 is disagreed to. And I call Amendment 9 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 25, 26, 27 and 28. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 9 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Convener, Amendment 9 is straightforward in its terms, and I hope its effect will be uncontroversial. It clarifies that the order-making power to be conferred on ministers is a power to set a cap on fees chargeable per academic year of a course, rather than to set a cap on the total fees chargeable for a course as a whole. I'm moving this amendment to make it absolutely clear that the fee cap is to relate to a particular academic year at a Scottish institution. This is essential to ensure there is no confusion among students or institutions as to what this section of the bill actually does. I made clear on many occasions, and I'm responding to Amendments 25, 26, 27 and 28 now, that I see the fee arrangements to the rest of the UK students as a necessary evil, which I would dearly like to see the back of. This government does not support tuition fees, and we have been consistent in our opposition to them in any shape or form. As the committee is well aware, this is the first year that the new fee arrangements for the rest of UK students have been in place, and they're having the desired effect of providing opportunities for Scottish domiciled learners to access places at Scottish universities. The provision in this bill, this provision seeks to provide a basis for formalising the voluntary agreement that we have with the sector, and Amendments 25 and 27 would detract from this. The aim of removing references to academic years seems to be that ministers will be prevented from setting the cap at more than the maximum total cost of the standard 3-year degree course elsewhere in the UK. But this fails to take account of the fact that some degrees elsewhere in the UK are longer than 3 years. Indeed, some are longer than 4 years. And so the amendments would not achieve their stated aim. All they would do would be to constrain ministers' power under Section 9C of the 2005 Act to set the cap in such a way that fees for any course at the Scottish institution did not exceed the highest fees which would be payable by the person if they attended any course elsewhere in the UK. This could include those which might be longer than 4 years. The amendments would therefore actually weaken the protection for the rest of the UK students which we have built into this provision. I'm sure that was not Mr Finlay's intention, but that would be the effect. On Liz Smith's Amendments 26 and 28, I'm aware of the concerns that University of Scotland have raised in relation to the aspects of the bill. I've looked again at the detail of the draft in the light of those concerns. I'm satisfied that the bill as drafted does not allow for the ambiguity claimed. I would continue to look at an amendment at stage 3 that did, in any sense, help this matter. But the proposed changes in this amendment actually introduce ambiguity into an already clear provision. Therefore, I'm sorry, I can't accept this. I would have accepted any such suggestion if it really did clarify. I think the bill is clear enough, but this amendment actually remains and indeed increases ambiguity. Therefore, I'd ask the committee to reject Amendments 25 and 27 from Neil Finlay and also reject Amendments 26 and 28 from Liz Smith.
Thank you very much. Can I call Neil Finlay to speak to Amendment 25 and other amendments in the group?
Thanks very much. Rest of UK students in Scotland see some of the highest fees in the whole of the UK, and we appear to have legislated for a market in education through the introduction of variable fees. There are no minimum standards or protections or safeguards for our UK students, and no provision to address fears around fair access or lack of fair access for the poorest our UK students. The provision contained within the bill is to set maximum amount chargeable by Scottish institutions to our UK students, linked to the maximum amount they'd be liable to pay in any given academic year elsewhere in the UK, and means that due to the 4-year degree structure, Scotland will now have potentially some of the most expensive higher education fees in the UK countries. The amendment would, as a bare minimum, reduce this fee cap to ensure that the costs faced are across the entire degree and is equalised between Scotland and the rest of the UK, not just across academic years. And I would certainly, and Amendment 27 simply follows on from that.
Thank you. Liz Smith to speak to Amendment 26 and other amendments in the group. Liz.
Thank you, Convener. I think generally content with the policy intentions of the section, but Cabinet Secretary, I do remain slightly concerned about the wording in this section so as to avoid a possible interpretation that the fees charged by Scottish universities to Welsh domiciled students would have to be at the maximum of the Welsh university rate. And therefore, the amendments 26 and 28 are designed to ensure there is absolute clarity on that. I'm not convinced that that clarity does not exist just now, so I would like to push the amendment 26.
Any other members wish to contribute to this section? George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. I think the whole debate here is the fact that there are fees within the rest of the UK, although that's not for today. But as the Cabinet Secretary says, it's a necessary evil at this stage, and I can't accept that these amendments 25 and 27 they would undermine the arrangements that are already been put in place to protect our UK students. So I have some concerns with that side of things, with 25 and 27. And as the Cabinet Secretary already said, the average degree in the UK doesn't seem to appear to be one, because it could be anywhere between 3 and 5 years. So I think on the whole 25 and 27 could make things even more difficult.
Thank you. Can I call the Cabinet Secretary?
I think I'd just like to repeat 2 points that I made. One is, in terms of the Smith's amendments, these amendments do introduce additional ambiguity. And in those circumstances, I remain open to any suggestion that might come from the sector or from this matter or elsewhere of any amendment that would decrease ambiguity, but I don't think we should be adding ambiguity to the bill at this stage. And just in terms of Mr. Finlay amendments, Mr. Finlay's amendment, I really would ask him not to press these because they would, in actual fact, make the situation worse for rest of the UK students. Those students would in actual fact be in the position of being worse off if these amendments were passed. So I don't think that is sensible, and certainly I would move my Amendment 9.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
It's agreed. Can I call Amendment 24 in the name of Neil Finlay in a group on its own? Neil Finlay to move and speak to Amendment 24.
Thanks very much, Convener. This amendment would require institutions to provide bursaries to students from low-income families from the rest of the UK so that they can afford the fees and increased living costs of coming to study in Scotland. We don't want particularly low-income and working-class families, students from the rest of the UK put off from applying to the universities such as St Andrews and Edinburgh and others because they have higher fees. So it's about making sure that students choose the institution and course that's right for them and not choose the price that is right for them, and it would place an obligation on the institutions to provide bursaries for those students.
Thank you. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you. I certainly believe that the provisions set out in Neil Finlay's Amendment 24, if not in place, it should be. I remain of the view, I'll share the view that NUS Scotland has, that the absence of an Office of Fair Accents or its equivalent in Scotland is unfortunate and a weakness in the arrangements north of the border. Indeed, while University of Scotland make claims about the relative spending on bursaries north and south of the border, it is interesting to note that the level of participation at university amongst those from more deprived backgrounds appears to be better and certainly improving faster down south than it is in Scotland. So I'll listen with interest to what the Cabinet Secretary has to say, but I think the amendment is well made.
Okay. If there are no other members who wish to speak at this stage, can I call the Cabinet Secretary?
Well, I think I am in agreement with some members of this committee, if not all of them, that the monetarisation of higher education has produced wrong and damaging consequences and should be rejected. And this amendment tends to indicate that. I know the issue that Mr Finlay is looking to address. I've spoken to the NUS about their concerns in this area a number of times, and we've developed and implemented proposals. But I believe that this proposed change is unnecessary for two reasons. Firstly, proposals we're setting out elsewhere in this bill to improve access will create a framework where universities will create opportunities for all learners wishing to pursue higher education in Scotland. And secondly, the evidence we have seen suggests our universities are already delivering extremely competitive and helpful bursary packages for the rest of the UK students. This would add additional complexity and additional bureaucracy in a situation where it's not necessary. The offers from our institutions compare favourably with their competitors, and this has helped them to see significant increases in applications from students from all backgrounds from elsewhere in the UK. The Office of Fair Access established south of the border was to mitigate a policy which I believe was wrong. We do not have that policy.
Thank you very much. Can I call Neil Finlay to wind up the debate and indicate whether he wishes to press or withdraw his amendment?
Just simply wish to press the amendments.
Okay, thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're not. Can I ask those members who are in favour of Amendment 24 to please indicate? Those against? Abstentions? Result of the vote on Amendment 24, 3 votes in favour, 6 votes against. Amendment 24 is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 25 in the name of Neil Finlay, already debated with Amendment 9. Neil Finlay to move or not move? Move. The question is that Amendment 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're not all agreed. Can I ask members to indicate those who are in favour of Amendment 25? Those against? Abstentions? The result of the vote on Amendment number 25 is that there were 2 votes in favour, 7 votes against. Amendment 25 is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 26 in the name of Liz Smith, already debated with Amendment 9? Liz Smith, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're not all agreed. Can members who are supporting Amendment 26 please indicate? Okay. Those against? Abstentions? The result of the vote on Amendment number 26, there were 4 votes in favour, 5 votes against. Amendment 26 is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 27 in the name of Neil Findlay, already debated with Amendment number 9? Neil Findlay, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not all agreed. Can members who support Amendment 27 please indicate? Those against? Thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment number 27, there were 2 votes in favour, 7 votes against. Amendment 27 is disagreed to. Can I call Amendment 28 in the name of Liz Smith, already debated with Amendment 9? Liz Smith, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 28 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're not all agreed. Can members who support Amendment 28 please indicate? Those against? Abstentions? The result of the vote on Amendment number 28, votes for 4, votes against 5. Amendment 28 was disagreed with. The question is that Section 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much. That ends today's consideration of the bill at stage 2. At next week's meeting, we will consider amendments to the rest of the bill. The deadline for lodging amendments to the remainder of the bill is this Thursday at noon. And can I suspend the meeting briefly? The next item is to take evidence on 3 related affirmative instruments as set out in the agenda. This item is an opportunity for members to ask any technical questions or to seek clarification on the instruments. The committee will then separately be invited to consider the motions to approve the instruments under agenda items 4, 5 and 6. Can I welcome to the committee this morning Aileen Campbell, Minister for Children and Young People, Kit Wyeth, Head of Children's Hearings Team, Iain Fitheridge, Policy Manager, Children's Hearings Team, Gordon McNicoll, Divisional Solicitor Deputy Director, and Kate Walker, Principal Legal Officer, Communities and Education Team, Scottish Government. I see the titles haven't got any shorter since I was a Minister. Can I invite the Minister to make a brief opening statement on all the instruments?
Thank you, Convener, for the opportunity to introduce 3 sets of subordinate legislation before us today. I want to start with the largest of the set of legislation, the draft Children's Hearings Procedural Rules. In summary, these rules set out the detailed procedures and timescales that are to be followed for the day-to-day management of children's hearings. These rules replace the existing Children's Hearings Scotland Rules 1996, which will be repealed on the 24th of June when the provisions of the Children's Hearings Scotland Act 2011 take effect. And unlike the 1996 rules, these rules clearly set out the steps for each type of children's hearing in a user-friendly manner. For example, grounds hearings and hearings to review existing orders. This has therefore resulted in the more detailed and larger set of rules before you as compared to the ones in 1996. Turning now to the Contact Directions and Relevant Persons Order, this draft order will ensure that all those who need it have the right to participate in the children's hearing system. It widens the category of persons who can seek a review of a contact direction in terms of section 126 of the 2011 Act. It also amends the definition of relevant person to include all parents as long as they've not had their parental rights and responsibilities removed. And finally, you've also before you a draft order which will modify the Public Services Reform Scotland Act 2010. And this draft order removes references to children's panels and children's panel advisory committees from the list of public bodies in Schedule 5 of the 2010 Act and adds Children's Hearing Scotland to the list. So thank you again for allowing me to introduce these instruments, and I'm of course happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Minister. Do members have any questions they wish to ask? Liz Smith.
Thank you, Minister, and I don't have any issues with the draft legislation that you've brought forward. Could I just ask a little bit about the criteria that you have used in assessing the system of the children's hearing and therefore the way in which you have built your policy objectives around that? What measurements have you been using in terms of the children's hearing system in its current form to set out these?
I take it, would you want me to talk about some of the road testing and some of the things that we've done?
Yep.
So there's been an extensive amount of work to make sure that these orders that are before you today are actually going to work in practice. So that has required a lot of road testing. I think there were 3 different meetings held over the autumn of last year, and those were run by children's hearing training officers, and they were led by the key people who drafted the 2013 rules and involved other partners such as reporters and Children's Hearing Scotland themselves. And of course a number of panel members across the country were invited to participate in those events and test the draft legislation in order to kind of flush out some of the issues that might have arisen, and in order to change and make sure that that's honed to reflect some of the feedback that we got. Feedback was positive, and it was just a few new types of feedback was generally positive, and so there was a few things that we had to change, but nonetheless it was a good process that we went through to make sure that these were working absolutely correctly. And can I just ask, obviously the feedback was largely positive, can I just ask if any concerns that were raised with the Scottish Government? I think it was more around, certainly in terms of the feedback, there was making sure that there was proper guidance around the right balance of information being disclosed to the relevant people. That the notification and the issue of papers and procedures and timescales was a workable format, and the procedures for a child or relevant person who has the right to legal aid, that those things were clear. So those were some of the things that we got back from the road testing and some of the feedback that we were allowed us to make sure that we got things absolutely right. Okay, thank you.
Any other members have any questions or points of clarification? Okay, can I move on to agenda item 4? Having received a briefing on the instruments, we now have to consider formally the motions to approve them. We will do this separately for each instrument. First, can I invite the Minister to speak to and move motion S4M 6538?
I move S4M 6538 that the Education and Culture Committee recommends that Public Service Oh, have I got the wrong one? Sorry.
No, that's the right one.
Is that the right one? Yes. Recommends that the Public Service Reform Scotland Act 2010 Modification Order 2013 be approved.
Any comments from members? I presume you don't have to wind up, Minister?
No, I'm happy. I'll leave you. You know you've had a long session.
Thank you very much. Okay, can I put the question then that motion S4M 6538 be agreed to? Are we all agreed? Yes. Can I move on to agenda item 5? I now invite the Minister to speak to and move motion S4M 6536.
Move that S4M 6536 that the Education and Culture Committee recommends that the Children's Hearing Scotland Act 2011 review of contact directions and definition of relevant person order 2013 be approved.
Thank you. Any comments from members? Therefore, can I ask that motion S4M 6536 be agreed to? Are we all agreed? That's agreed. Thank you. Moving on to item 6 on our agenda. Finally, I invite the Minister to speak to and move motion S4M 6537.
I move that S4M 6537 that the Education and Culture Committee recommends the Children's Hearing Scotland Act 2011 Rules of Procedure and Children's Hearing Rules 2013 be approved.
Can I invite any comments from members on this item? None. Therefore, can I ask whether motion S4M 6537 be agreed to? Are we all agreed? That's agreed to. The committee's report to the Parliament on these instruments will confirm the outcome of the debate. And can I thank the Minister and officials for attending the session, and I close the meeting.